Chronology is not merely a technical apparatus of historical analysis. It is the architecture that supports all claims to temporal authority. The question of when something happened governs the interpretation of what happened, why it occurred, and who had control over its narration. This investigation opens with a confrontation between two titanic historical constructs, the chronological framework of ancient Egypt and the biblical narrative timeline. At stake is not just the integrity of historical knowledge, but the legitimacy of entire civilizational claims to truth, morality, and divine mandate. The central inquiry, whether Egypt's chronology was manipulated to accommodate later biblical constructs, is not a matter of academic curiosity. It strikes at the foundation of how societies encode memory, power, and sacred history. The establishment of Egyptian chronology stands as one of the oldest and most seemingly stable timelines in the ancient world. Anchored in king lists, monumental inscriptions, and astronomical data, it presents itself as internally coherent and meticulously maintained. Yet the sheer antiquity of Egyptian civilization, spanning over 3 millennia, has always made it a challenge to reconcile with the linear, much shorter biblical narrative. From the earliest attempts by Jewish and Christian writers to identify the pharaoh of the Exodus, to modern efforts by radical revisionists to compress or reorder dynastic sequences, the pressure to force Egypt into the biblical mold has been persistent and ideologically charged. The very act of comparing these two timelines presupposes a desire for harmony between sacred text and archaeological record. This harmonization was never a neutral scholarly endeavor. Rather, it was shaped by theological anxiety, institutional pressure, and civilizational pride. In societies where the Bible functioned not just as scripture but as the ultimate source of historical truth, any discrepancy with the Egyptian record posed a threat. Either the Bible had to be allegorized, or Egypt's past had to be reshaped. Frequently, it was the latter option that prevailed. What does it mean to manipulate a chronology? The process is often subtle, removing inconvenient dynasties, compressing centuries, conflating names, retrojecting events, or selectively interpreting textual sources. The manipulation need not be deliberate falsification. It can arise from cultural bias, theological pre-commitments, or epistemic limitations. Yet the cumulative effect can rewrite entire epochs of human history. When religious timelines carry the weight of divine authority, the temptation to subordinate empirical data to sacred narrative becomes immense. This inquiry does not presuppose that all biblical history is false or that Egyptian records are infallible. Rather, it proceeds from the position that all historical constructs must be interrogated critically. The Bible is not just a theological document, it is also a timeline. The same applies to Egypt's king lists. Both assert mastery over time, both claim continuity, and both seek to impose an order upon the chaotic unpredictability of human events. Where they intersect, friction arises. That friction has produced centuries of revision, debate, censorship, and ideological struggle. The script will proceed systematically. It begins by establishing the native systems of timekeeping in both traditions, how the Egyptians recorded regnal years, and how biblical authors encoded genealogies and prophetic epochs. It will then explore the pivotal moments of chronological collision, the dating of the Exodus, the reign of Solomon, the invasion of Shishak, the reigns of Ramses, and the identification of pharaohs in the Hebrew scriptures. From there, it will trace the impact of early Christian chronographers, Jewish apologetics, and the Renaissance impulse to create universal chronologies. At each step, the analysis will isolate points where Egyptian history was bent, compressed, or translated into a framework more favorable to scriptural coherence. A key figure in this process is Manetho, the Egyptian priest writing in Greek under Ptolemaic rule. His king lists, though fragmentary and often corrupted through transmission, became the scaffolding for later chronological synthesis. The way his work was treated, cited, edited, rearranged, offers insight into the ideological operations of chronology in the service of religion. Later figures such as Eusebius, Syncellus, and Josephus will be examined for how they appropriated or edited Egypt's past to serve salvation history. The narrative will then shift toward the modern period, where scientific tools such as radiocarbon, dating, stratigraphy, and astronomical retrocalculation challenged scriptural timelines. The emergence of Egyptology as a discipline with its own standards of verification marks a critical rupture. Yet this did not end the contest. Revisionists, like Velikovsky, attempted to reconfigure Egyptian history entirely to uphold biblical chronology, prompting intense academic backlash. The analysis will not focus on the credibility of such theories per se, but rather on the epistemological battle they represent. At the heart of this inquiry lies a more fundamental question. Who has the authority to tell time? Chronology is not a passive recording of events. It is a tool of governance. Ancient monarchs used king lists to project legitimacy. Religious traditions encoded timelines to validate prophecy. Empires standardized calendars to assert dominion. In this context, any effort to harmonize or manipulate Egyptian chronology for biblical purposes must be seen not as an innocent interpretive exercise, but as a political act, a claim to truth that seeks to erase contradictions and assert supremacy. To fully grasp the stakes of this conflict, one must abandon the notion of chronology as objective data and understand it as contested terrain. The investigation will not merely identify discrepancies, but will trace the institutional forces, ideological commitments, and historical pressures that shaped the way timelines were constructed, revised, and weaponized. Egypt's past, in this light, becomes not a fixed sequence of dynasties, but a field of ideological struggle, a canvas upon which competing visions of history projected their truths. This opening section does not offer conclusions. It initiates a forensic process. The goal is not to side with either Egypt or the Bible, but to interrogate the historical mechanisms that forced them into uneasy alignment. By tracing the manipulation of Egyptian chronology across centuries, this script seeks to illuminate not just the historical distortion, but the underlying structures of power that made such distortion both possible and necessary. The chronology of ancient Egypt is widely regarded as one of the earliest and most meticulously recorded in human history. Its roots extend deep into the early dynastic period, evolving through successive innovations in administration, record-keeping, and monumental commemoration. Far from being a simple list of names and dates, Egyptian chronology was a complex cultural construct. It functioned not only as a means of temporal orientation but also as a political instrument to legitimize dynastic continuity and divine kingship. Understanding this system is crucial, for it provides the foundation upon which later reinterpretations, manipulative or otherwise, would be built. Egyptian timekeeping was anchored in the reigns of kings. Events were dated relative to the year of the reigning pharaoh, not to a universal calendar. For example, an event might be noted as occurring in year 4 of the reign of Thutmose III. There was no absolute dating system analogous to the Christian calendar or even the later Seleucid era. Everything revolved around the pharaoh's sovereignty. This system inherently localized time within the political framework of each dynasty. As a result, reconstructing a linear, continuous chronology from Egypt's records requires external cross-referencing, interpretive judgment, and often a degree of speculation, conditions ripe for ideological reshaping. The Egyptians maintained detailed king lists, the most famous of which include the Palermo stone, the Turin royal canon, and the Abydos king list. These were not simply archival records, but also ritual and ideological artifacts. They served to validate the authority of current rulers by displaying an unbroken succession from divine or semi-divine founders. In many cases, inconvenient rulers, such as usurpers, foreign invaders, or those associated with heresy, e.g., Akhenaten, were omitted. This selective memory indicates that even native Egyptian chronology was shaped by political and religious considerations long before any biblical harmonization was attempted. Furthermore, the Egyptian calendar was lunar-solar with a civil calendar of 365 days divided into 12 months of 30 days plus 5 epagomenal days. This system caused a gradual drift against the solar year, which only corrected itself over a cycle of 1,160 years, known as the Sothic cycle. This astronomical drift and the attempt to reconcile it with heliacal risings of Sirius and agricultural rhythms complicates modern attempts at aligning Egyptian chronology with other ancient systems. Scholars use Sothic datings, astronomical diaries, and temple alignments to triangulate key chronological anchors. These methods are not foolproof, leaving room for debate and reinterpretation. The structural complexity of Egyptian chronology is further compounded by the fragmentation of political authority across Egypt's history. During the First and Second intermediate periods, Egypt was divided between rival dynasties ruling concurrently from different cities. Manetho, writing in the 3rd century BCE, would later list these dynasties in sequence, giving the misleading impression of continuous rule. Without clear cross-dynastic synchronisms, this mistake creates artificial chronological inflation. A combined total of reigns, when actually overlapping, could easily stretch a timeline beyond its real length, presenting an opportunity for later harmonizers to compress the timeline and fit biblical events more comfortably. In addition to native sources, Egyptian chronology began to be filtered through foreign interpreters, most notably the Greeks. When Egypt fell under Hellenistic rule, scholars like Manetho wrote in Greek for a foreign audience. This translation across cultures and languages inevitably introduced distortions. Manetho's king lists were structured to be intelligible to a Greek worldview that valued systematization and chronology in the manner of Herodotus or Thucydides. His work no longer followed the ritual logic of native king lists, but attempted to place Egypt within a universal, secular historical narrative, already a profound epistemic shift. The interaction of native Egyptian systems and external frames of interpretation created a hybrid chronology, still grounded in pharaonic authority, but now articulated for foreign theological, political, or philosophical consumption. It is within this hybrid space that manipulation becomes possible. The Greek language king lists offered a textual gateway into Egypt's past for later Jewish and Christian writers who did not have access to hieroglyphic or demotic inscriptions. These foreign authors became the new custodians of Egyptian time, even though their access was mediated, incomplete, and ideologically constrained. Egyptian chronology, then, was never a static truth. It was a dynamic, living construct generated by court scribes, myth-makers, astronomer priests, and foreigner interpreters. Its authority came not from mechanical accuracy, but from its political utility. When scholars or priests sought to legitimize a ruler, explain a divine sign, or commemorate a sacred event, they did so by locating it in time. That act of temporal placement was never neutral. It was an assertion of order over chaos, divinely sanctioned and socially binding. This understanding casts doubt on any notion of Egyptian chronology as a purely objective data set waiting to be aligned with the Bible. The timeline was already shaped by internal pressures long before external manipulation occurred. What later harmonizers encountered was not a pure chronology, but a layered and ideologically saturated construction. Their efforts to synchronize it with the Bible inevitably involved selection, omission, and reorganization. Finally, it is important to recognize that chronology was power, To control the timeline was to control the narrative of civilization. In this regard, Egypt functioned as both the historical other and the foundational before to Western religious traditions. Its antiquity posed a theological threat. If Egyptian records were older than the biblical flood, then what did that say about the universality of biblical time? If Egyptian kings ruled in continuity while biblical genealogies contained gaps and ambiguities, which account was to be believed? The manipulation of Egyptian chronology must therefore be seen in the broader context of narrative control, a struggle not just over dates, but over the very structure of time and memory. This section has established that Egyptian chronology, while impressively detailed, was neither immune to ideological shaping nor resistant to external appropriation. Its intrinsic complexities, regnal dating, political fragmentation, calendar drift and transmission through foreign languages, created vulnerabilities. These vulnerabilities would later be exploited by those seeking to bring Egypt into the orbit of biblical history. The manipulation, therefore, did not begin as deception, but emerged from the structural openness of the chronological system itself, a system that could be and would be reconfigured to serve theological ends. The key biblical narrative is not merely a collection of religious doctrines or moral teachings. It is also an intricate timeline structured through genealogies, reigns, and prophetic epochs that form a coherent, if constructed, chronological arc. From the creation in Genesis to the fall of Jerusalem in Kings and Chronicles, the Hebrew Bible presents a continuous sacred history. This history is not neutral, it is deliberately shaped to affirm divine election, covenantal fulfillment, and eschatological expectation. Understanding how early biblical chronology was constructed is essential to examining how it later clashed with, and potentially reshaped, Egypt's temporal record. The earliest biblical chronological system emerges from the genealogies of Genesis, where the lifespans of patriarchs are carefully recorded. Adam lives 930 years, Seth 912, Methuselah 969, and so on. These are not casual insertions but foundational to the theological structure. They are designed to create a continuous, traceable line from the first human to Abraham, the father of nations. Each generation is marked with numerical precision, serving both as theological assertion and chronological scaffold. Yet the numbers themselves vary dramatically between the Masoretic text, the Septuagint, and the Samaritan Pentateuch, indicating that even from its inception, biblical chronology was mutable and ideologically charged. The construction continues with the chronology of the Exodus, the wilderness period, the conquest of Canaan, the era of the judges, the reigns of the Israelite and Judean kings, and the Babylonian exile. This sequence is not a passive recording of historical events. It is designed to frame Israel's history as a fulfillment of divine promise and as a cyclical pattern of sin, punishment, repentance, and redemption. Events are dated not by independent calendrical systems, but through regnal years, prophetic, visions, and covenantal milestones. The time frames are not universally fixed. Instead, they are narratively necessary. Their function is theological, to prove that God intervenes in history according to a divine plan. Biblical chronology is especially notable for its use of symbolic and numerologically significant time periods. 40 years recur frequently. The wandering in the wilderness, the reigns of David and Solomon, the duration of various periods of oppression and deliverance during the Judges. These numbers do not merely record, they encode meaning. They indicate completeness, testing, or divine judgment. Similarly, the 480 years mentioned in 1 Kings 6:1 as the period between the Exodus and the construction of Solomon's temple appears contrived to create numerical symmetry. This suggests that numbers serve rhetorical and theological aims more than empirical accuracy. The centrality of Jerusalem and the temple in this narrative framework means that all other civilizations are cast as contextual or antagonistic. Egypt appears as both cradle and oppressor, a land of refuge for Abraham and Joseph, but also a place of bondage for Moses. Egypt is not given a chronology in the Hebrew Bible, it is merely a background stage, its timeline subsumed into the biblical master narrative. The absence of Egyptian kings' names, except vague references like Pharaoh or Shishak, reinforces the Bible's inward focus. Yet, this very absence later became a problem when scholars attempted to align the biblical story with the Egyptian timeline. The lack of synchronisms created gaps that required creative harmonization. The Book of Judges is particularly chaotic in its chronological sequence. It lists a series of judges who ruled for specified numbers of years, often without clear transitions or overlapping reigns. If taken literally, the cumulative total far exceeds the time span allowed by other biblical markers. Scholars, both ancient and modern, have attempted to reconcile these durations through compression, overlap, or allegorical reading. The result is a deeply unstable chronological segment, one that later harmonizers had to reshape in order to align with external histories such as that of Egypt. A key turning point in biblical chronology is the reign of Solomon, presented as a golden age of unity, wisdom, and temple construction. Solomon's 40-year reign becomes a pivotal marker for dating the Exodus, the building of the temple, and the division of the kingdom. From this node, backward calculations are made to the patriarchs, and forward estimates to the exile. The dating of Solomon's reign thus became an obsession for chronographers trying to link biblical history with external chronologies. Whether Solomon ruled in the 10th or 9th century BCE has implications not only for the historicity of the united monarchy, but for the dating of the Exodus and the identification of Egyptian pharaohs involved in biblical events. The desire to create a seamless sacred history drove early Jewish and Christian thinkers to construct comprehensive biblical chronologies. The most influential example is the Seder Olam Rabbah, a 2nd century CE Jewish chronographic work that attempts to date all biblical events from creation onward. It truncates Persian history and simplifies complex successions to preserve a rigid biblical timeline. This compression demonstrates a clear willingness to override non-biblical evidence in favor of internal theological consistency. The chronology is not falsified out of ignorance but shaped deliberately to support religious narrative cohesion. Christian scholars adopted a similar approach, often combining biblical genealogies with historical data to produce universal chronologies. Eusebius of Caesarea, the early church historian, created a chronological canon that placed biblical events alongside Greek, Roman, and Egyptian timelines. His work was not neutral but apologetic, intended to prove that biblical history was superior in antiquity and coherence to pagan histories. The inclusion of Egyptian data was selective and subordinated to the biblical framework. Eusebius did not treat Egypt as an independent chronological authority, but as a witness whose testimony had to be adjusted to fit Scripture. This trend continued into the medieval period, where the Bible functioned as the ultimate historical source. Chronicles were structured around biblical epochs, and secular history was considered valid only insofar as it corroborated scriptural time. This epistemological hierarchy ensured that when discrepancies arose between Egyptian chronology and biblical records, it was Egypt's timeline that had to give way. Biblical chronology was not subject to falsifiability. It was the lens through which all other histories were judged. In this environment, manipulation of Egyptian data was not seen as deceitful, but as a necessary correction of pagan error. Thus, early biblical chronology established a theological timeline that resisted contradiction. Its ambition was not to record empirical events, but to encode divine purpose. Time was structured teleologically, not descriptively, The result was a chronological system that was internally coherent, symbolically potent, and ideologically rigid. It did not seek harmony with external timelines, but rather compelled them to conform. When Egyptian history entered the biblical consciousness, whether through Exodus narratives, apocalyptic visions, or missionary exegesis, it had to be reinterpreted to serve this sacred order. This section has demonstrated that biblical chronology, far from being a passive record, was an active theological construct. It was designed to establish divine legitimacy, covenantal coherence, and prophetic fulfillment. Its time frames were flexible when necessary, symbolic when expedient, and authoritative, beyond question. This created a powerful interpretive system, one that later scholars would go to great lengths to defend by reshaping, reordering, or erasing the historical record of other civilizations, including Egypt. The biblical narrative of the Israelite conquest of Canaan following the Exodus from Egypt and the wilderness period presents a tightly packed chronology loaded with theological significance. This sequence, Exodus, wandering, conquest, settlement, spans roughly one generation and is presented as a fulfillment of divine promise. However, when juxtaposed with the archaeological and textual record of the late Bronze Age Levant and contemporary Egyptian sources, the result is a landscape of contradictions, absences, and irreconcilable timelines. The attempt to bridge these divergent records has become one of the most contentious efforts in ancient historiography, raising critical questions about whether Egypt's chronology was manipulated to resolve the dissonance. The biblical text places the Exodus approximately 480 years before the construction of Solomon's Temple, 1 Kings 6:1, which is traditionally dated around the mid-10th century BCE. This places the Exodus in the 15th century BCE. However, the most frequently proposed candidate for the pharaoh of the Exodus, Ramses II, reigned in the 13th century BCE, nearly 2 centuries later. This mismatch has provoked centuries of chronological contortion. Some scholars reject the biblical number as symbolic or theological. Others shift the dates of Solomon. Still others attempt to compress Egyptian chronology to accommodate an earlier Ramses or propose a pharaoh-less Exodus that left no trace in Egyptian records. One of the most glaring problems arises from the book of Exodus itself, which states that the Israelites settled in the land of Ramesses, Exodus 1:11. This reference appears anachronistic if the Exodus took place in the 15th century BCE, as the city of Pyramesses was built during the reign of Ramses II, beginning around 1270 BCE. To preserve both the biblical timeline and the historical Ramses, some suggest that Rameses is a later editorial insertion, or that it refers to an earlier, unrelated toponym. These rationalizations underscore the pressure to harmonize incongruent sources, often at the expense of empirical coherence. The archaeological record of Canaan during the supposed period of conquest also fails to align with the biblical account. The book of Joshua describes the dramatic destruction of cities like Jericho, Ai, and Hazor. However, excavations at Jericho show no significant destruction layer in the late Bronze Age. Ai, identified with Et Tel, appears to have been unoccupied during the purported time of conquest. Hazor does show signs of violent destruction, but its dating remains debated. The cumulative evidence suggests that if there was a conquest, it was not as described, sudden, total, and divinely ordained. Instead, the settlement patterns suggest gradual infiltration, cultural diffusion, or internal social transformation. These archaeological inconsistencies have profound chronological implications. If the biblical conquest cannot be verified through destruction layers, synchronous city building, or textual corroboration from Egypt, then either the conquest did not happen as written, or it happened in a different time period. To resolve this, some scholars propose a late Exodus model, placing the Exodus in the 13th century to match Ramses II and the Meneptah stele, which is the earliest known Egyptian reference to Israel as a people in Canaan. However, this model shortens the period of the Judges and contradicts the 480 years of 1 Kings 6:1, requiring reinterpretation or outright dismissal of the biblical number. Alternatively, others retain the 15th century Exodus by manipulating Egypt's chronology, compressing dynasties, revising king lists, or discarding entire segments of Egyptian history. These efforts, often associated with radical revisionists like Immanuel Velikovsky or David Rohl, argue that Egyptian history has been artificially lengthened and that aligning it with the Bible requires removing phantom dynasties or reassigning archaeological layers. While these theories have been widely rejected in mainstream academia, their persistence reveals the perceived necessity of resolving the chronological dissonance between Egypt and the Bible. Egyptian records themselves are conspicuously silent. On any event resembling the biblical Exodus, there are no references to mass slave uprisings, miraculous plagues, or the drowning of armies in the sea. Apologists often respond by citing Egyptian reluctance to record defeats, yet this is an insufficient explanation for the total absence of corroboration across multiple dynasties, genres, and regions. Furthermore, Egypt maintained detailed administrative records, including the Turin papyrus, which lists foreign workers and their origins. No entry resembles the mass Hebrew migration depicted in the Bible. This absence has led some to suggest that the Exodus was a mythologized memory of a much smaller or entirely different event. The Merneptah stele, dated to around 1207 BCE, offers the first extra-biblical mention of Israel. It does not describe a conquest, but simply states that Israel is laid waste, its seed is not. The context is a military campaign in Canaan, possibly by Pharaoh Merneptah. The reference suggests that an entity called Israel existed in the highlands of Canaan during this period, but it provides no support for the Exodus narrative or its chronology. In fact, it places Israel in Canaan before any putative conquest could have occurred, raising further questions about the reliability of the biblical timeline and the appropriateness of attempting to synchronize it with Egypt's historical record. The broader geopolitical context also complicates matters. During the Late Bronze Age, Egypt maintained direct administrative control over Canaan through a network of vassal states and garrisoned outposts. The Amarna letters, a cache of diplomatic correspondence from the 14th century BCE, demonstrate that Egypt was actively involved in Canaanite affairs. There is no mention of Israelite invasions, uprisings, or conquests. Instead, the letters speak of internal conflicts among city-states and requests for Egyptian military assistance. If the Israelites were conducting a widespread conquest during this time, they left no trace in these detailed and wide-ranging documents. This section exposes the depth of chronological dissonance between the conquest narrative and the Egyptian historical framework. The attempt to reconcile these timelines has generated two dominant responses: manipulation of Egyptian chronology to match the Bible, or reinterpretation of the Bible to align with empirical data. Both approaches reflect an underlying anxiety, one theological, the other historiographical. The stakes are not just about dates, but about authority. A harmonized chronology would affirm the Bible as a reliable historical source. A fragmented or disproven one would suggest that foundational events like the Exodus and conquest are either mythicized or misdated. It is within this atmosphere of dissonance and ideological pressure that Egyptian chronology became a target. If the conquest could not be found in the Egyptian record, perhaps the Egyptian record was flawed. If destruction layers did not match biblical claims, perhaps archaeologists misread them. Such thinking opens the door to revisionism, not always fraudulent, but often driven more by theological commitment than empirical rigor. This manipulation may take the form of compression, shortening dynasties, substitution, replacing pharaohs, or realignment, reordering events to match biblical expectations. Each approach reflects a refusal to let the dissonance stand unchallenged. Thus, the conquest narrative becomes a fulcrum upon which the credibility of both biblical and Egyptian chronologies balance. Their misalignment is not simply an academic puzzle. It is a threat to theological coherence and historical confidence. The attempts to resolve this have often led to the re-engineering of Egypt's past, whether through early church chronographers, Renaissance harmonizers, or modern revisionists. These efforts set the stage for further manipulation, reinforcing a pattern in which sacred narrative drives historical rearrangement. The conquest narrative's demands did not merely affect biblical interpretation, they directly influenced how Egypt's chronology was subsequently written, revised, and reimagined. The figure of Manetho occupies a central, though paradoxical, position in the construction of Egyptian chronology as it became known to the Greek and later Western world. Writing in the 3rd century BCE under the patronage of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Manetho was an Egyptian priest tasked with compiling a systematic history of Egypt in the Greek language. His work, the Egyptiaca, now survives only in fragments quoted by later authors such as Josephus, Africanus, Eusebius, and Syncellus. Though incomplete and mediated, Manetho's king lists became the foundation of modern Egyptology. Yet from its origin, this body of knowledge was filtered through political and cultural imperatives that compromised its neutrality and in many ways prepared it for subsequent manipulation to harmonize with biblical chronologies. Manetho's context was a volatile one. He served at a time when Egypt was under Greek control, governed by the successors of Alexander the Great. The Ptolemaic regime sought legitimacy by portraying itself as the heir to ancient pharaonic tradition. In this setting, Manetho's history was not a purely scholarly endeavor. It was a work of political integration designed to bridge native Egyptian identity and Hellenistic power. To that end, his king lists were structured to be intelligible to a Greek audience. Dynasties were defined in ways familiar to Greek historiography, emphasizing linear succession and rational ordering, qualities not native to earlier Egyptian king lists, which were often fragmented, ritualistic, and ideologically curated. The structure Manetho provided, 30 dynasties grouped chronologically, was entirely artificial. Egyptian history had no such native divisions. Dynastic transitions were not always sharp, co-regencies overlapping. Reigns and rival lineages were common, yet Manetho's format imposed a clean temporal progression. This systemization, while useful for categorization, introduced a distortion. It transformed the complexity of Egyptian succession into a rigid framework that could be exploited by later chronologists seeking to align Egypt with other historical timelines, especially the biblical one. Manetho's original texts are lost. What remains are second- and third-hand quotations, often conflicting, embedded within Christian chronographies compiled centuries later. Eusebius, Syncellus, and Africanus used Manetho to construct universal histories that placed the Bible at the center of world chronology. In doing so, they edited, abbreviated, and sometimes altered Manetho's data. These manipulations were not neutral errors of transmission, they reflected theological imperatives. The compilers sought to synchronize Egypt's history with biblical epochs, such as the creation, the flood, the Exodus, and the reigns of Solomon and David. Where discrepancies existed, Manetho's account was adjusted. Josephus, writing in the 1st century CE, was among the earliest to engage with Manetho critically. In Against Apion, he aimed to defend Jewish antiquity against Hellenistic skeptics. Josephus both cited and challenged Manetho, accusing him of errors and fabrications, especially regarding the Hyksos, whom Josephus sought to identify with the Israelites. In doing so, Josephus performed an interpretive transformation. He reframed Egypt's foreign invaders as the biblical Hebrews and reinterpreted their expulsion as the Exodus. This maneuver effectively inserted the biblical narrative into Egyptian history, not by discovering new data, but by reshaping existing accounts to suit theological needs. Later, Christian writers continued this trend. They were less concerned with Egyptian internal chronology than with its ability to confirm the biblical record. Eusebius, in particular, altered dynastic totals, abbreviated reigns, and omitted inconvenient rulers. In his Chronicon, he treated Manetho not as an independent authority but as a resource to be domesticated. The result was a chronologically compressed Egypt, with dynasties shortened or rearranged to accommodate biblical dating. This manipulation was framed not as distortion but as correction, bringing pagan history into the service of revealed truth. The survival of Manetho's material through theological filters ensured that Egypt's historical narrative would be subordinate to religious orthodoxy for centuries. Even as Egyptology developed in the modern era, it inherited a system already shaped by these earlier manipulations. The divisions between dynasties, the chronological estimates of reigns, and the assumed sequence of rulers all emerged from a tradition already saturated with biblical harmonizing efforts. Modern scholars often attempt to reconstruct Manetho's original lists through critical comparison, but the foundational structure remains shaped by its reception history. One of the key areas of concern is the treatment of overlapping dynasties. Egyptian history includes periods of fragmentation, especially during the first and second intermediate periods, when multiple rulers governed concurrently in different regions. Manetho's system, and especially its later Christian redactions, treated these periods as sequential rather than parallel. This approach artificially inflated the length of Egyptian history, creating apparent contradictions with biblical timelines. Later harmonizers, observing this inflated span, proposed that Egyptian chronology had been exaggerated and thus needed to be compressed, a conclusion that then served as justification for revising Egypt's timeline downward to fit biblical models. This dynamic, where initial distortion creates further justification for revision, reveals a recursive logic in the manipulation of chronology. It begins with a systematization imposed for political or cultural reasons, followed by theological reinterpretation, and ends in chronological compression or reassignment. Each stage builds upon the previous one, compounding the divergence from Egypt's native historical framework. By the time modern scholars encountered the Manethonian tradition, it was no longer purely Egyptian, but a hybrid construct, already deeply entangled with biblical ideology. Manetho's work, therefore, becomes both a source and a symptom of the problem. It offers the semblance of empirical continuity, a catalogue of names and reigns, yet it does so through a lens already distorted. The manipulation was not necessarily malicious, but it was consequential. It provided a framework flexible enough to absorb biblical synchronisms and authoritative enough to silence contradictions. In this way, Egypt's history was canonized, not on its own terms, but as a background chronicle to the biblical drama. The authority of Manetho persisted even after the decipherment of hieroglyphs and the emergence of modern Egyptology. Early Egyptologists like Bruges and Champollion worked within the dynastic framework inherited from Manetho. Though epigraphic and archaeological data have since refined the timeline, the 30-dynasty structure remains embedded in scholarly convention. This persistence reflects more than convenience. It reveals the inertia of inherited systems. Once a chronological structure becomes institutionalized, it resists change, even when its foundations are known to be compromised. In sum, Manetho's king lists were not an objective transmission of native Egyptian history, but a politically and theologically mediated construct. Written for a Greek audience, preserved by Christian apologists, and adapted to serve biblical synchronism, they laid the groundwork for centuries of chronological manipulation. The acceptance of these lists as canonical, despite their fragmentary and ideologically shaped transmission, exemplifies the broader pattern of subordinating Egypt's past to external narratives. The manipulation of chronology did not begin with radical revisionists. It began with the very framework through which Egypt's history was first systematically known in the West. The transmission of Manetho's king lists through Christian historiography was not a passive preservation of historical record, it was a project of ideological reformation. Figures such as Eusebius of Caesarea and George Syncellus played pivotal roles in shaping how Egypt's past would be understood by later generations. Their chronologies were not independent efforts to document time, but were theological systems constructed to reinforce Christian salvation history. As custodians of time, these chronographers inherited both a methodological framework from Hellenistic historiography and a theological imperative to align all world history under a biblical axis. Egypt's timeline, long and complex, had to be fitted into this schema, and to do so it was compressed, rearranged, or rewritten. Eusebius, writing in the early 4th century CE, produced the Chronicon, a monumental attempt to synchronize the histories of various ancient civilizations, Babylonian, Greek, Roman, and Egyptian, with the narrative of the Hebrew Scriptures. The Chronicon survives only in fragments, primarily through the Latin translation of Jerome and the later chronography of Syncellus. Eusebius's method involved placing parallel columns of different chronologies side by side, visually asserting their convergence and relative position. This format, deceptively systematic, masked the methodological arbitrariness beneath the surface. The act of aligning disparate chronologies necessitated the manipulation of durations, omission of inconsistencies, and selective citation of sources like Manetho. Eusebius treated the biblical timeline as the unerring backbone of universal history. Other chronologies were valid only to the extent that they corroborated Scripture. Where discrepancies arose, adjustments were made, typically at the expense of pagan or foreign sources. Egyptian dynasties that could not be reconciled with biblical events were either abbreviated, omitted, or assigned implausible overlaps. Dynasties whose reign lengths threatened to extend the history of Egypt beyond the accepted date of creation were particularly vulnerable. The theological position was clear: no civilization could predate Adam, and no kingdom could contradict the sequence laid out from Genesis to Christ. Syncellus, writing in the 8th or 9th century CE, continued this tradition, but also sought to restore and preserve earlier sources. In his Chronographia, Syncellus attempted to recover the original text of Manetho and to reconcile it with the biblical framework. However, his task was fraught with contradiction. On one hand, he criticized Eusebius for corrupting the Egyptians' king lists. On the other, he shared Eusebius's theological assumptions. The result was a hybrid chronography, an amalgamation of corrected citations, editorial interventions, and theological reinterpretations. Syncellus presented himself as a restorer, but his framework remained subordinated to the same biblical chronology that had shaped Eusebius's work. The methods used by Eusebius and Syncellus to manipulate Egyptian history were varied. One common strategy was the reduction of reign lengths. Where Manetho assigned 300 years to a dynasty, later chronographers might shorten it to 150 to align with their total chronology. Another method was the reassignment of dynasties from sequential to parallel, overlapping reigns used to compress the total timeline. Occasionally, entire dynasties were omitted, deemed irrelevant or heretical. These decisions were not footnoted or justified with textual evidence. They were presented as factual corrections, even though they altered the substance of Egypt's historical record. This manipulation extended beyond Egypt. The chronographers also compressed Persian, Assyrian, and Babylonian histories to fit the biblical time frame. But Egypt presented a unique challenge due to its perceived antiquity and the comprehensiveness of its historical claims. The king lists, temples, and monuments of Egypt testified to a history that far exceeded the limits of biblical chronology. The Nile Valley, with its seemingly timeless civilization, threatened to undermine the authority of Genesis. For this reason, Egypt was not simply compressed, it was reframed. Its history became a cautionary tale, a story of false religion and ephemeral grandeur, subordinated to the unfolding narrative of divine election and redemption. The implications of this framework were far-reaching. By canonizing a version of history in which Egypt's chronology was made subordinate to the Bible, Eusebius and his successors established a paradigm that persisted into the early modern period. Historians, theologians, and mapmakers operated within a worldview where the biblical timeline defined the limits of possibility. Discrepant data from Egypt or any other ancient culture could be dismissed or reinterpreted. This historiographical control created an enduring structure of knowledge in which questions about Egypt's antiquity were not resolved empirically, but theologically. The process was also reinforced institutionally. The authority of the Church, the centrality of Scripture, and the marginalization of pagan learning ensured that the Christian chronographic model dominated medieval thought. Manuscripts of Manetho's work were transmitted not as independent historical sources but as appendices to theological projects. Libraries, scriptoria, and universities reproduced the framework established by Eusebius and Syncellus without re-examining its assumptions. The Egyptian past remained locked in a narrative structure that had been engineered for religious coherence, not historical accuracy. It is important to recognize that these early Christian chronographers did not view their work as manipulation. From their perspective, they were clarifying, correcting, and fulfilling the historical record in light of divine revelation. Their fidelity was not to empirical data, but to theological truth. Egypt's history was valuable not for its own sake, but for what it could confirm about the scriptural narrative. This epistemological hierarchy placed divine history above all other accounts. The reshaping of Egyptian chronology was not a concession but an assertion of superiority. This ideological control over chronology extended into how time itself was conceptualized. Biblical history was linear, teleological, and moralized. Egyptian history, by contrast, was cyclical, monumental, and politically legitimizing. In aligning Egyptian chronology with the Bible, Christian historians were not merely adjusting dates, they were redefining the meaning of history. Events that did not fit the moral arc of fall and redemption were either erased or reinterpreted. Time was not a neutral medium but a battleground for theological supremacy. By the time Renaissance and Enlightenment thinkers rediscovered classical sources and began to question received chronologies, the damage had already been done. Egypt's past had been filtered through over a millennium of theological compression. Reconstructing a historically accurate timeline required not just archaeological effort, but also ideological disentanglement. The shadow of Eusebius and Syncellus remained long after their methodologies were discredited, embedded in the very structure of how history was taught, written, and interpreted. In this context, the question of manipulation becomes more than a historiographical concern. It becomes a reflection of how knowledge is constructed, maintained, and justified. The inheritance of history from figures like Eusebius and Syncellus is not a neutral archive, but a curated artifact, one shaped by power, belief, and the desire for narrative control. Egypt's chronology, once autonomous and deeply embedded in its own religious and political structures, was redefined in service to a foreign theological agenda. That redefinition continues to influence how we understand not only Egypt, but the entire temporal architecture of the ancient world. Flavius Josephus stands as one of the earliest and most influential figures in the defense of Jewish antiquity against Greco-Roman skepticism. Writing in the late 1st century CE under Roman patronage, Josephus sought to present the history of the Jewish people not as a local or marginal chronicle, but as a central component of world history. His works, particularly against Apion, attempted to position the Hebrew scriptures within a broader historical discourse that included Egyptian, Greek, and Mesopotamian sources. In this apologetic endeavor, Josephus turned to Egyptian history, specifically Manetho's narratives, to validate the Exodus and elevate Jewish antiquity. The result was a deliberate reframing of Egyptian chronology and myth to accommodate and affirm the biblical record. Josephus's primary concern was reputation. In a Greco-Roman intellectual context that often dismissed the Jews as recent, sectarian, or culturally derivative, he presented them as ancient, monotheistic, and morally superior. This necessitated a polemical engagement with competing histories, especially those that portrayed Egypt as the cradle of civilization. To reverse the narrative, Josephus had to demonstrate that Jewish history was not only ancient, but older than that of Egypt, Greece, or Rome. His weapon of choice was historiography, selectively citing and reinterpreting non-Jewish sources to align with the biblical account. In Against Apion, Josephus challenges Manetho's portrayal of the Hyksos, a Semitic group that ruled parts of Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period. Manetho, as quoted by later authors, presents the Hyksos as foreign invaders who were eventually expelled by native Egyptian rulers. Josephus seizes on this narrative and equates the Hyksos with the Israelites, suggesting that their expulsion was in fact the Exodus. This identification, though lacking archaeological and textual corroboration, allowed Josephus to reframe a moment of Egyptian restoration as a biblical triumph. In doing so, he inserted Israel into Egyptian history not as a marginal tribe, but as a decisive player in the dynastic struggle of Egypt's past. This rhetorical maneuver had far-reaching implications. It forced a chronological realignment in which the biblical Exodus, dated by Josephus several centuries earlier than most modern scholars place it, was superimposed onto the Egyptian expulsion of the Hyksos. This identification collapsed distinct historical episodes into one, erasing the complex internal dynamics of Egypt's Second Intermediate Period in favor of a theologically convenient synthesis. The Hyksos were transformed from an amorphous category of foreign rulers into proto-Israelites, their expulsion recast as divine liberation, and their cultural footprint retroactively sanctified. Josephus also addressed other elements of Egyptian chronology that threatened the antiquity of Jewish history. He criticized Egyptian king lists that suggested a longer timeline than that allowed by the Hebrew scriptures. Whenever Egyptian dates contradicted the Bible, Josephus questioned their reliability, accused pagan historians of exaggeration, or claimed textual corruption. By elevating the scriptural record as the benchmark of truth, he placed all other chronologies in a subordinate and suspect position. This framework enabled subsequent generations of Christian and Jewish writers to dismiss Egyptian antiquity whenever it challenged the biblical narrative. The apologetic nature of Josephus's historiography is critical. His method was not empirical. It was theological and rhetorical. He did not seek independent verification of events. Rather, he sought to persuade a skeptical audience of the truth and superiority of the Jewish tradition. To do so, he shaped history around Scripture, not the other way around. His engagement with Egyptian sources was not an attempt at cross-cultural understanding, but a strategic reappropriation. Egypt's history became raw material to be mined, reinterpreted, and subordinated to the biblical plot. Josephus's influence extended beyond the Jewish community. Christian apologists and church historians drew heavily on his work, treating him as a bridge between the biblical and classical worlds. Because he was Jewish by birth, Roman by citizenship, and conversant in Greek historiography, his synthesis carried unique authority. Church fathers such as Origen and Jerome relied on Josephus to bolster claims of biblical reliability. The identification of the Hyksos with the Israelites, though methodologically dubious, became embedded in the Christian imagination. Egypt's second intermediate period was reframed not in terms of dynastic upheaval, but as the biblical exodus writ large. This historiographical inheritance reinforced a view of Egyptian chronology as malleable, a system that could be adjusted to support theological conclusions. Josephus's strategy of equating disparate figures, timelines, and episodes provided a template for future manipulation. It introduced the practice of conflating Egyptian dynasties with biblical characters, whether through direct identification or chronological approximation. This conflation blurred the boundaries between independent traditions and set a precedent for future compressions and alignments. In addition, Josephus's framing contributed to the moralization of Egyptian history. Egypt was not simply another ancient civilization, it was a symbol of oppression, idolatry, and decadence. By portraying Israel's departure from Egypt as both a literal and spiritual emancipation, Josephus reinforced the theological dichotomy between Egypt and Israel, between paganism and monotheism. And this dualism would be echoed in later Christian writings, where Egypt became an archetype of sin and exile, while Israel represented election and redemption. Manipulating Egypt's chronology was thus not just an intellectual exercise, it was an act of moral clarity, affirming the righteousness of the biblical narrative. Josephus's apologetic historiography illustrates how Egypt's timeline was reconfigured not through forgery, but through persuasive reinterpretation. His work demonstrates the early stages of a broader process, the submission of Egyptian history to the authority of Scripture. By setting a precedent for identifying biblical events within Egyptian history, despite lack of material evidence, he opened the door to further chronological engineering. Later, harmonizers, faced with more detailed Egyptian records, would repeat his approach with greater complexity but similar intent. In conclusion, Josephus's engagement with Egyptian history reveals a deliberate reshaping of chronology to serve theological argumentation. His reinterpretation of the Hyksos as Israelites, his critique of Egyptian king lists, and his prioritization of biblical time over pagan records all contributed to the subordination of Egypt's past within a biblical framework. This method, though framed as historical defense, was a form of chronological appropriation. It redefined Egypt's place in history, not according to its own records, but in service to a sacred narrative whose authority could not be questioned. Josephus did not manipulate Egyptian chronology through fabrication, he did it through selective emphasis, interpretive equivalence, and theological necessity. The Renaissance and Reformation periods marked a turning point in the Western world's confrontation with time, history, and textual authority. These centuries witnessed the rediscovery of classical sources, the rise of critical scholarship, and the fragmentation of religious unity. Yet even amid growing intellectual pluralism, the biblical timeline retained a central role in shaping historical understanding. Chronology during this period was not only a tool of measurement, it was a battlefield where theology, politics, and science collided. Egypt, with its monumental antiquity and vast dynastic records, stood at the center of this collision. The effort to reconcile Egyptian history with the Bible intensified, producing increasingly elaborate, often strained, chronological syntheses. These efforts reflected not only the persistence of inherited paradigms, but also the institutional and ideological stakes of maintaining scriptural supremacy. The early Renaissance was marked by a renewed interest in ancient texts, fueled by the humanist movement's emphasis on philology, translation, and historical inquiry. Figures such as Petrarch and Boccaccio helped revive classical Latin literature, while the rediscovery of Greek manuscripts opened new vistas of ancient history. Among these was renewed access to fragments of Manetho and early Christian chronographers, like Eusebius. These sources were treated as vital tools for reconstructing a universal history of humankind. However, the methods of Renaissance scholars remained deeply conditioned by theological commitments. The timeline of world history was still understood through the lens of biblical events: creation, the flood, the Exodus, the monarchy of Israel, the Babylonian exile, and the coming of Christ. The most influential Renaissance chronologist was undoubtedly Joseph Justus Scaliger. His De Emendatione Temporum, 1583, and Thesaurus Temporum, 1606, attempted to construct a precise, mathematically rigorous chronology that harmonized biblical, Greek, Roman, and Egyptian histories. Scaliger was a pioneer of historical criticism, introducing astronomical data and calendar reform into the study of time. Yet despite his methodological innovations, he retained the core assumption that biblical chronology was the skeleton upon which all other histories must be draped. Egyptian dates were subordinated to Genesis-based calculations. When discrepancies arose, Egyptian reigns were compressed or reinterpreted to preserve the continuity of sacred history. Scaliger's efforts were echoed and expanded by James Ussher, the Anglican Archbishop of Armagh, whose chronology placed the creation of the world at 4004 BCE. Ussher's calculations, published in Annales Veteris Testamenti, 1650, became canonical for generations, famously included in the margins of many English Bibles. Ussher's influence cannot be overstated. By assigning precise dates to all biblical events, he created a rigid temporal framework that resisted contradiction. This framework dictated how other chronologies, including Egypt's, were to be read. Ussher's method did not allow for Egyptian dynasties extending back thousands of years before Adam. Instead, they had to be either compressed, misdated, or deemed fraudulent. The Reformation intensified these dynamics by reconfiguring the authority of Scripture. Protestants rejected the ecclesiastical traditions of the Catholic Church in favor of sola scriptura, Scripture alone, as the basis for truth. This shift elevated the Bible from a source among many to the exclusive touchstone of historical and theological legitimacy. As a result, biblical chronology was not merely central, it was absolute. Any challenge to its timeline was perceived as a challenge to the authority of divine revelation. Egyptian chronology, when conflicting with biblical dates, thus became a target for correction rather than a subject of open-ended inquiry. Catholic scholars, though less radical in their methods, were equally invested in defending the integrity of biblical chronology. Jesuit historians and scholars from institutions such as the Collegio Romano engaged in elaborate reconciliations of ancient sources with Scripture. Their goal was not to question the Bible's temporal structure, but to protect it against Protestant revisionism and secular critique. Egypt, as a repository of potentially rival antiquity, was treated cautiously. Manetho's dynasties were analyzed, but their dates were often allegorized or adjusted to prevent them from undermining the accepted biblical timeline. The competing chronologies of this period were also politically charged. As European powers expanded their empires, they sought historical legitimacy for their civilizational superiority. The ability to define the past, particularly a past as prestigious as Egypt's, became a form of soft power. Chronological manipulation served not only religious dogma but imperial ideology. By subordinating Egypt's antiquity to biblical chronology, European scholars implicitly asserted that Western civilization was the heir to all meaningful human development. Egypt was cast not as an independent origin, but as a precursor to the Judeo-Christian narrative validated only insofar as it pointed toward biblical fulfillment. Printed books and new forms of dissemination further cemented these chronologies. Genealogical charts, historical tables, and annotated Bibles became popular tools for teaching and visualizing history. These instruments codified manipulated timelines, presenting them as objective truth. Generations of students, clergy, and literate elites were educated within a framework where Egyptian history was aligned with biblical epochs through approximated identifications of pharaohs, speculative dating of dynasties, and harmonized timelines based on theological premises. This pedagogical infrastructure created durable barriers to critical re-evaluation. The persistence of harmonized chronologies was not merely a product of ignorance or dogma, it was embedded in the epistemology of the time. Time itself was seen as linear, moralized, and teleologically driven. The Bible's timeline offered a grand narrative of creation, fall, redemption, and salvation. In this structure, other histories were subordinated, not dismissed, but integrated as supporting evidence. Egypt could be included, but only as a foil or a confirmation, never as a challenger. Its monuments were admired, its science respected, but its independent historical voice remained suppressed. As archaeological expeditions began to recover Egyptian texts, monuments, and artifacts in the late 17th and 18th centuries, these discoveries were interpreted within the inherited framework. Hieroglyphs remained unreadable, but monumental inscriptions were dated based on guesswork or aligned with known biblical events. This premature harmonization gave the illusion of empirical support for the established chronology. Egypt's own records, though silent or contradictory, were bent into conformity. The Renaissance and Reformation thus entrenched a model of time in which Egypt's chronology was acceptable only when it echoed biblical narratives. The manipulation was not conducted in secret or with malicious intent, it was institutional, systematic, and embedded in the core assumptions of early modern thought. Chronologists did not think they were falsifying history, they believed they were clarifying it in light of divine truth. This section reveals that by the time critical tools became available, philology, archaeology, astronomical dating, the damage had already been done. Egypt's timeline had been shaped for centuries by scholars operating under the twin pressures of religious orthodoxy and civilizational pride. Their chronologies were not the result of free investigation, but of necessity, an effort to safeguard the coherence of a sacred narrative by ensuring that Egypt could never stand apart from or above the timeline of the Bible. Among the most exploited features of ancient Egyptian chronology are the so-called Dark Ages, periods marked by political fragmentation, reduced monumental output, and sparse textual records. These intervals, notably the first intermediate period, c. 2181–2055 BCE, and the second intermediate period, c. 1650–1550 BCE, present a gap-filled and uncertain timeline that has repeatedly been leveraged by those seeking to harmonize Egyptian history with biblical narratives. These interruptions in dynastic continuity and documentation created zones of interpretive pliability, windows through which speculative realignment could be justified. Chronological manipulation in this context was not limited to external adjustment. It was often enabled by the intrinsic structural weaknesses in Egypt's own historical record. The first intermediate period followed the collapse of the Old Kingdom and was characterized by decentralization, with competing power. Centers in Heracleopolis and Thebes, the absence of monumental king lists from this era, coupled with poor archaeological visibility, has made precise dating difficult. Similarly, the second intermediate period featured the rule of the Hyksos in the Nile Delta, alongside native dynasties ruling from Thebes and other regions. Manetho's treatment of these periods, later transmitted by Christian chronographers, portrays them as dynastic sequences, yet modern Egyptology recognizes them as largely contemporaneous polities. This distinction between sequence and simultaneity holds significant consequences for the construction of an overall timeline. By treating overlapping dynasties as sequential, earlier chronologists inadvertently inflated Egypt's historical duration. Later harmonizers, particularly during the Renaissance and Enlightenment, seized upon this inflated timeline to argue for chronological compression. If dynasties once assumed to be successive were instead parallel, the total span of Egyptian history could be reduced, thereby opening the possibility of aligning key events, such as the Exodus, with historically attested reigns. This compression was framed as a correction of error rather than an act of historical reshaping. Yet it entailed substantive alterations to Egypt's dynastic structure, motivated not by internal evidence, but by external narrative pressures. The flexibility of these dark periods made them particularly attractive for harmonization with biblical history. For example, the Hyksos' expulsion from Egypt during the late Second Intermediate Period has often been equated with the biblical Exodus. Although the Hyksos were Semitic-speaking and their departure was indeed a moment of significant political transformation, the correlation remains speculative and unsupported by direct textual links. Nevertheless, the chronological vagueness of this interval enabled the projection of the biblical narrative onto the Egyptian framework. The lack of precise synchronisms, rather than inhibiting interpretation, invited revisionist insertion. Furthermore, the gaps in the Egyptian record provided plausible deniability for absence. When no pharaonic documentation could be found corroborating the events of the Exodus or the conquest of Canaan, it could be argued that the records were lost during a dark age, destroyed in invasions, or never produced due to social disarray. These rationalizations allowed for the continued assertion of biblical accuracy despite the absence of Egyptian confirmation. In this sense, the weaknesses in Egypt's chronological corpus did not simply permit harmonization, they immunized it from falsification. The methodological implications of this are significant. In periods of rich documentation, contradiction is immediately apparent and must be confronted. In periods of darkness, however, silence becomes interpretive space. This asymmetry means that Egypt's gaps are not neutral, they are operationalized. By those seeking to insert extrinsic narratives, chronology becomes elastic, capable of expansion or contraction depending on the theological or ideological needs of the interpreter. This elasticity was further enabled by the way Egypt's chronology was constructed in the modern period. Lacking a native continuous calendar, modern Egyptology has relied heavily on relative dating, using regnal years and archaeological strata, and only anchoring events to absolute dates through astronomical events, such as the Sothic cycle. These anchor points are few and contested, leaving large portions of the timeline open to interpretive dispute. When combined with textual gaps from intermediate periods, the result is a chronology riddled with zones of uncertainty, zones that invite manipulation. Revisionists have taken advantage of this structural indeterminacy. Advocates of revised chronologies often begin by collapsing the intermediate periods or eliminating entire dynasties they claim are misdated or redundant. They argue that these periods were artificially inserted or expanded by early chronographers working with corrupt Manethonian traditions. By compressing or excising these intervals, they create room to shift Egyptian events forward in time, making it possible to identify biblical figures such as Joseph, Moses, or Solomon within the archaeological or textual record of a revised Egypt. These efforts, while methodologically aggressive, are rooted in the perceived opportunity afforded by the Dark Ages. Mainstream Egyptology, while rejecting radical revisionism, has also been forced to acknowledge the limitations of the current timeline, Debates over the dating of the Thera eruption, the reliability of Sothic dating, and the relative sequences of dynasties continue to generate scholarly controversy. Yet within academic circles, these debates are framed by empirical constraints: pottery, typology, stratigraphic layering, radiocarbon data. Outside these constraints, however, speculative synchronization continues, driven less by evidence than by narrative coherence with the Bible. The broader cultural function of these dark periods must also be considered. They serve as historical palimpsests, eras where competing stories can be written without immediate contradiction. Egypt's discontinuities become theological opportunities. The Exodus fits here, Joseph's rise fits there, Solomon's diplomatic engagements echo in a poorly documented trade mission. Each insertion is justified by the silence of the record, not by its affirmation. In this way, the Dark Ages are transformed from historiographical challenges into instruments of apologetic history. This dynamic illustrates a recurring pattern. Wherever the Egyptian record is weak, the biblical narrative expands. Wherever the Egyptian record is strong, the biblical narrative retreats into allegory or abstraction. Chronological manipulation, in this context, is not merely about numbers. It is about exploiting structural weaknesses for ideological ends. It is the insertion of sacred narrative into historical vacuum, the occupation of silence by a louder story. The Egyptian Dark Ages, then, are not merely periods of decline or transition. They are critical nodes in the history of chronological manipulation. Their gaps, ambiguities, and structural vulnerabilities have rendered them perpetual targets for harmonization with external narratives, especially those of the Bible. The willingness to reshape or compress these periods reflects a deeper epistemological commitment that the biblical timeline must prevail, and where the historical record does not affirm it, it must be bent to do so. As later sections will show, these strategies of exploitation extend beyond the Dark Ages and into periods of apparent Egyptian clarity. But the Dark Ages remain the entry point, the soft underbelly of Egyptian chronology through which theological ambitions have repeatedly entered and altered the flow of historical time. The decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs by Jean-François Champollion in the early 19th century marked a watershed in the study of ancient history. For the first time, Egypt could speak in its own words, through its own inscriptions, rather than through the interpretive lens of Greek historians, biblical commentators, or Christian chronographers. This development represented a methodological rupture, offering a corpus of native texts that could, in theory, confirm or challenge established historical frameworks. Yet the consequences of Champollion's breakthrough were not immediately embraced. Instead, the emergence of Egyptology collided with entrenched theological timelines and chronologies that had, for centuries, subordinated Egyptian history to biblical authority. The new philological tools threatened to destabilize not only conventional understandings of Egypt, but the entire temporal architecture upon which biblical historicism had been built. Champollion's achievement, announced in 1822, was the product of careful comparative analysis of the Rosetta Stone, a trilingual inscription in Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic script. By using the known Greek text as a guide, Champollion was able to identify proper names and phonetic signs in the hieroglyphic version. His work revealed that the ancient Egyptian script was not purely symbolic or ideographic, as many had believed, but included phonetic components that could be read as language. This realization opened a floodgate of textual material. King lists, temple inscriptions, mortuary texts, legal decrees, and everyday documents, all waiting to be read, catalogued, and dated. With this new access came the possibility of constructing an independent Egyptian chronology, one grounded in native sources, rather than in Greek redactions or theological constraints. The implications were profound. Names like Ramses, Thutmose, Amenhotep, and Akhenaten could now be directly linked to specific events, buildings, and texts. The regnal years of pharaohs could be traced across multiple inscriptions, enabling cross-referencing and the establishment of relative dating sequences. For the first time, Egyptology had the means to challenge or confirm the historical claims made in the Bible. However, the newfound clarity did not lead to immediate re-evaluation. The broader intellectual culture of the early 19th century remained steeped in biblical chronology. The prevailing assumption was that the Hebrew scriptures provided the definitive account of ancient history. Archaeology and philology were expected to confirm, not revise, that account. Scholars often began with the assumption that the Bible was correct and sought corroborative data in Egyptian records. When such corroboration failed to appear, or worse, when Egyptian texts contradicted the biblical timeline, interpretive strategies were deployed to minimize the divergence. For example, Champollion himself, though acutely aware of the antiquity and complexity of Egypt's dynastic history, operated within the constraints of Christian chronology. His identification of Ramses II as the builder of pyramids and his placement of that pharaoh in the 13th century BCE should have raised critical questions about the timing of the Exodus. Yet rather than confront the inconsistency directly, scholars hesitated, often suggesting that the biblical date needed re-evaluation or that the name Ramesses was a later editorial gloss. The disjunction between Egypt's own records and the biblical narrative was acknowledged but not fully explored. The reluctance to break with tradition reflected more than intellectual caution. It revealed the institutional and cultural entrenchment of biblical time. Universities, churches, and national academies continued to promote harmonized chronologies in which Egyptian data were selectively used to illustrate or affirm scripture. Even as hieroglyphic translations accumulated and Egypt's historical sequence grew more robust, the gravitational pull of the Bible remained strong. Egypt was allowed to speak, but only within the boundaries of an already established scriptural drama. Over time, however, the sheer volume of Egyptian data began to force a reckoning. The continuity of dynastic reigns, the succession of pharaohs, and the consistency of regnal years across vast periods presented a historical record that could not easily be compressed into a 6,000-year biblical framework. The Old Kingdom alone, with its extensive pyramid building and bureaucratic records, occupied more time than many theologians had allocated to all of human history. The New Kingdom, with its detailed military campaigns, international correspondence, and monumental inscriptions, defied alignment with biblical episodes such as the Exodus, the Judges, or the United Monarchy of Israel. As Egyptology matured, scholars began to develop independent dating systems. These relied on astronomical data such as the Sothic cycle and synchronisms with other ancient civilizations, particularly the Hittites, Assyrians, and Babylonians. Radiocarbon dating, when it became available, further reinforced the depth and internal consistency of Egyptian chronology. These methods collectively displaced the Bible as the central chronological authority. The shift was not sudden, but it was irreversible. Egypt could now be dated on its own terms, and its history could no longer be seamlessly folded into the narrative structure of Genesis, Exodus, and Kings. Yet the consequences of this shift extended beyond academia. The disjunction between Egypt's chronology and the Bible posed a theological crisis for traditions that had long relied on scriptural historicity. The inability to locate the Exodus in Egyptian records, the misalignment of pharaohs with biblical kings, and the absence of archaeological support for the conquest of Canaan began to erode confidence in the literal truth of biblical history. Apologists responded with new strategies, allegorical readings, symbolic timelines, or arguments for lost records. But the authority of biblical chronology had been irreparably weakened. Champollion's breakthrough, then, did more than decipher. a script. It exposed the vulnerability of a system that had long subordinated history to theology. The reaction to this exposure was mixed. Some embraced the opportunity to reconstruct a new historical narrative, free from inherited constraints. Others resisted, clinging to harmonizations and revisionist schemes designed to preserve scriptural coherence. The birth of Egyptology was thus not only an intellectual achievement, but a cultural rupture, a moment when the autonomy of one of the world's oldest civilizations could no longer be denied, concealed, or reshaped to fit external agendas. In deep retrospect, the resistance to Champollion's implications reveals the power of chronology as a tool of belief. It is not merely a sequence of dates, but a structure of meaning. When that structure is threatened, entire worldviews come under strain. The story of Egyptology's emergence is therefore not just about language or archaeology. It is about the struggle between competing temporal systems, one grounded in empirical evidence, the other in sacred narrative. The manipulation of Egyptian chronology did not end with Champollion's decipherment, but his work irrevocably shifted the balance. From that point forward, Egypt could speak for itself, and what it said often contradicted what had been said about it for centuries. In the mid-20th century, a new chapter in the conflict over Egyptian chronology emerged with the publication of Immanuel Velikovsky's Ages in Chaos, 1952. With its provocative claims and sweeping revisions, the book ignited controversy across both academic and popular domains. Velikovsky's central thesis was that the conventional Egyptian chronology had been artificially extended by centuries, and that when properly corrected, it would align neatly with biblical history. He proposed a radical compression of dynasties, a reassignment of events, and a reinterpretation of archaeological evidence, placing figures such as Solomon and Ahab in synchronism with Egyptian pharaohs who, under mainstream chronology, were centuries removed. His work was simultaneously condemned as pseudo-scientific and celebrated as revelatory. Whether viewed as heresy or as an intellectual corrective, Velikovsky's revisionism exemplified the enduring temptation to manipulate Egypt's timeline. In defense of biblical coherence, Velikovsky's motivation was not merely historical, it was ideological. He believed that ancient texts, including the Bible, preserved accurate memories of catastrophic events that had been dismissed or misdated by modern historians. He charged that Egyptologists, locked into rigid dynastic sequences built on uncertain foundations, had ignored or misinterpreted evidence that could validate biblical chronology. In his view, the accepted timeline of Egypt, especially the New Kingdom, was bloated with phantom centuries. By collapsing these periods, he claimed to reveal synchronisms between Egypt and Israel that had been obscured by scholarly bias. Among Velikovsky's most dramatic assertions was that Thutmose III, a prominent 18th dynasty pharaoh, should be identified with the biblical Shishak, the Egyptian king said to have invaded Judah during the reign of Rehoboam, 1 Kings 14:25-6. In conventional chronology, Thutmose III reigned in the 15th century BCE, while Shishak is placed around 925 BCE, more than 5 centuries later. Velikovsky argued that this discrepancy was the result of a mistaken dynastic sequencing, and that correcting it would restore the true historical setting of biblical events. Similar re-identifications appeared throughout Ages in Chaos, effectively relocating major biblical figures into different centuries of Egyptian history. This methodological inversion, restructuring Egypt's timeline to fit the Bible rather than questioning biblical dating, reinvigorated long-standing patterns of chronological subordination. Velikovsky rejected the authority of radiocarbon dating, astronomical synchronisms, and stratigraphic sequencing when they contradicted scriptural narrative. Instead, he privileged textual harmonization, proposing equivalencies based on thematic or linguistic similarities rather than contextual evidence. His approach was not empirical, but comparative and rhetorical, driven by a belief in the inherent reliability of ancient accounts that modern science had discredited. Academic reaction to Velikovsky was swift and overwhelmingly negative. Prominent scholars denounced his methodology, accused him of misusing sources, and warned of the dangers of pseudo-historical thinking. Egyptologists pointed out that collapsing dynasties destroyed carefully established sequences of reigns supported by inscriptions, monuments, and cross-cultural synchronisms. Archaeologists noted that his revisions required the abandonment of established stratigraphic relationships. Astronomers and physicists rejected his related theories on planetary catastrophism, further undermining his intellectual credibility. Yet, despite the criticism, Velikovsky found a receptive audience among segments of the public, especially those with theological or ideological commitments to biblical literalism. His work appealed to readers who perceived mainstream academia as dismissive of religious history and who were eager for a framework that reaffirmed the historical truth of the Bible. For these readers, Velikovsky was not a heretic, but a prophet, challenging the dogmas of secular science and restoring sacred chronology to its rightful place. His books sold widely, were translated into multiple languages, and sparked numerous conferences, debates, and derivative theories. The Velikovskyan controversy also exposed the epistemological fault lines in the study of ancient history. On one side stood a model of knowledge grounded in empirical verification, methodological skepticism, and interdisciplinary triangulation. On the other stood a model oriented around textual coherence, traditional authority, and interpretive freedom. The battle was not simply about dates. It was about what counted as evidence, who had the right to interpret the past, and what the purpose of history was. Importantly, Velikovsky's appeal to revisionism did not exist in isolation. His work spawned a broader movement of alternative chronologies, including those proposed by Donovan Corville, David Rohl, and others who continued to argue that Egypt's timeline had been misaligned with biblical history. These theorists often focused on the same points of weakness identified by Velikovsky: the Dark Ages, the ambiguities in Manetho's dynasties, and the apparent absence of biblical events from Egyptian records. Their solutions varied in detail, but shared a common goal: restructuring Egypt's past to affirm biblical chronology. The persistence of these theories reflects a deeper cultural and psychological need for coherence. The Bible, for many, is not simply a religious text. It is a foundational historical document. When its chronology is undermined by external data, believers face a dilemma: accept the discrepancy and weaken scriptural authority, or revise external history to restore alignment. Velikovsky offered the second option, and despite his rejection by the scholarly mainstream, his model has remained influential in apologetic circles. From a historiographical perspective, Velikovsky's intervention is instructive. It demonstrates how vulnerable ancient history is to ideological appropriation, especially when it involves cultures whose records are fragmented, complex, or open to multiple interpretations. Egypt, with its long gaps, obscure inscriptions, and dynastic discontinuities, remains a prime target. Velikovsky's method, though extreme, follows a familiar logic. Where Egypt's record is silent, insert the Bible. Where it contradicts the Bible, restructure it. Where ambiguity exists, exploit it. In the aftermath of Velikovsky's impact, Egyptology doubled down on methodological rigor. Scholars refined their dating techniques, expanded excavations, and produced more precise historical reconstructions. Yet the shadow of ages in chaos lingers, reminding us that history is never immune to reinterpretation and that the manipulation of chronology remains a live issue, not just in theological debates, but in broader cultural negotiations over truth, authority, and identity. Ultimately, Velikovsky's work is not significant for its specific proposals, which have been widely rejected, but for what it reveals about the ongoing struggle to control the narrative of the past. Whether branded heresy or revelation, his revisionism underscores the enduring tension between empirical history and sacred narrative, between Egypt as an autonomous civilization and Egypt as a backdrop to the Bible. The chronological compression he advocated may not have held up to scrutiny, but the impulse behind it continues to animate debates over ancient time. As Egyptology matured and the volume of archaeological data expanded, the field began to rely increasingly on scientific methods to construct and verify chronological frameworks. Radiocarbon dating, stratigraphic analysis, and typological sequencing became standard tools in this effort. These methodologies provided independent lines of evidence that could, in theory, affirm or challenge the conventional Egyptian timeline. At the same time, they introduced new standards of falsifiability that place significant constraints on speculative harmonizations with the biblical record. The manipulation of Egyptian chronology became more difficult in the face of reproducible, scientific data, but the desire to align Egypt's history with Scripture did not vanish. Instead, it began to operate through selective acceptance, rhetorical evasion, and the redefinition of methodological legitimacy. Radiocarbon dating, or C14 dating, became widely applied in Egyptian archaeology in the mid-20th century. The method relies on measuring the decay of carbon-14 isotopes in organic material, such as wood, charcoal, or plant fibers, recovered from stratified archaeological contexts. Though subject to calibration curves and environmental variables, radiocarbon dating provides approximate date ranges that are independently derived from historical texts. When applied to Egyptian contexts, these results overwhelmingly supported the conventional dynastic chronology. For example, samples from Middle Kingdom burials, New Kingdom temples, and late-period settlements consistently dated within ranges that matched inscriptions and king lists. The implications of these results for biblical harmonization were significant. Attempts to compress Egyptian chronology, such as those proposed by Velikovsky and his successors, often required shifting entire dynasties forward by several centuries. Radiocarbon data made such moves untenable. Wood samples associated with New Kingdom architecture could not be moved from the 13th century BCE to the 9th without contradicting measured isotopic decay. While margins of error in the early decades of the technique allowed some wiggle room, continued refinement and the development of high-precision calibration curves narrowed the range of acceptable adjustments. Radiocarbon chronology effectively hardened the temporal structure of Egyptian history. Stratigraphy provided another line of resistance to chronological revisionism. Based on the principle of superposition, wherein older layers are found beneath newer ones, stratigraphic excavation allows archaeologists to reconstruct the sequence of occupation at a site. In multi-layered cities such as Tel Megiddo, Lachish, or Thebes, stratigraphy reveals not only the order of construction and destruction, but also the cultural materials associated with each level, pottery styles, architectural forms, and administrative. Seals provide relative dating that can be cross-referenced with neighboring regions. These sequences, when aligned with Egyptian inscriptions or known military campaigns, provide powerful synchronisms. For example, the destruction layer at Beth Shean corresponds with a well-documented Egyptian withdrawal in the early Iron Age. In such cases, biblical narratives, if out of sync with stratigraphy, must be interpreted cautiously. Harmonizers, seeking to impose a biblical conquest model on Canaan, have struggled to reconcile the archaeological strata with the supposed timeline of Joshua's campaigns. Sites that should show destruction in the Late Bronze Age often do not. Others that were destroyed have no biblical counterpart. The stratigraphic record thus resists manipulation through its internal coherence and cross-cultural linkage. Typology, particularly ceramic typology, further reinforces this resistance. Pottery, ubiquitous in the archaeological record, evolves, predictably over time in form, decoration, and manufacturing technique. By creating ceramic sequences, archaeologists can relatively date sites and levels, even in the absence of inscriptions. In Egypt, as in the Levant, pottery sequences have been firmly established and used to anchor broader chronologies. Attempts to reassign entire cultural horizons, such as moving the Late Bronze Age forward by centuries, would require a wholesale redefinition of ceramic evolution, which contradicts hundreds of well-dated contexts. Pottery, silent but reliable, defies arbitrary chronological revision. Despite this growing body of evidence, the so-called evidence gap remains a point of contention. Biblical maximalists frequently note the absence of explicit references to major biblical events in Egyptian records. There is no clear Egyptian account of the Exodus, no mention of Moses, and no inscriptional evidence confirming Israelite slavery or the plagues. Likewise, major figures from the United Monarchy, David Solomon, do not appear in contemporary Egyptian sources. These absences are used both by critics of the biblical record and by revisionists seeking alternative chronologies that might explain the silence. However, the evidence gap is not unilateral. Egyptian records are often propagandistic, selective, and focused on elite achievements. They seldom detail internal dissent, failed campaigns, or mass migrations unless politically useful. Entire dynasties have left minimal inscriptions. Moreover, perishable materials such as papyrus have rarely survived outside desert conditions. Therefore, the absence of evidence cannot be treated as definitive refutation, but it cannot be ignored either. It raises legitimate questions about the scale and historicity of the biblical events in question. For biblical harmonizers, the evidence gap poses a problem of method. Scientific dating techniques constrain the manipulation of Egyptian chronology, while the absence of confirmatory evidence for key biblical events undermines confidence in traditional timelines. In response, some apologists have turned to speculative synchronisms, arguing that biblical figures appear under different names or that records were destroyed in deliberate purges. Others posit that Israelite history was largely oral until much later, and therefore left no trace. These positions, while not inherently implausible, shift the burden of proof and move the discussion into the realm of conjecture. In contrast, critical scholars argue that the divergence between the Egyptian record and the biblical timeline reflects not an error in Egyptian chronology, but the mythologization of the biblical narrative. In this view, the Exodus, conquest, and United Monarchy are composite stories shaped over centuries that retroject national identity into an imagined past. Egypt's silence is not a problem, it is a clue. It indicates that the biblical narrative, while culturally powerful, should not be read as literal history. This perspective requires no manipulation of Egyptian chronology. It demands instead a re-evaluation of textual interpretation and historiographical practice. In sum, the rise of scientific dating methods has made chronological manipulation increasingly untenable. Radiocarbon data, stratigraphic sequences, and typological frameworks converge on a coherent timeline that resists compression, reassignment, or harmonization with the traditional biblical chronology. The evidence gap, while real, does not justify chronological revisionism. Rather, it invites a critical examination of the assumptions underlying historical reconstruction. Egypt's record, though incomplete, is anchored by physical evidence that can be tested, replicated, and debated within a framework of methodological transparency. The same cannot be said for speculative synchronisms driven by theological necessity. The result is a new evidentiary landscape, one in which Egypt's history asserts its autonomy, and where efforts to subordinate it to biblical narrative must contend not with texts alone, but with layers of earth, artifacts, and isotopes. Chronology, once shaped by scribal tradition and theological imperatives, now finds itself grounded in the physical sciences. Manipulation is still possible, but its boundaries are shrinking. Nowhere is the pressure to harmonize Egyptian chronology with biblical narrative more acutely felt than in the interpretation of Egypt's 18th and 19th dynasties, periods of imperial expansion, monumental construction, and extensive documentation. These dynasties produced some of Egypt's most well-known pharaohs: Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Seti, Thutmose, and Ramses II. Their reigns, stretching roughly from the 16th to the 12th century BCE, coincide with the Late Bronze Age in the Levant and encompass the time frame in which biblical chronology places key events: the Exodus, the conquest of Canaan, and the establishment of the Israelite monarchy. The problem lies in the absence of direct synchronisms. Despite abundant Egyptian records, no unequivocal mention of the Israelites, Moses, or the Exodus has been found. In response, harmonizers have attempted to realign, reinterpret, or compress these dynasties to force the desired connections. The result is a web of strained identifications and chronological rearrangements that highlight the tension between evidence and theological necessity. Ramses II, known for his long and prosperous reign, c. 1279–1213 BCE, has become the most frequently proposed candidate for the pharaoh of the Exodus. This identification is based largely on the mention of the city of Pyrameses in Exodus 1:11 and the grandeur of Ramses' construction projects, military exploits, and centrality in later Egyptian memory. Pyrameses was his capital in the Nile Delta and a site of immense royal building activity. The assumption is that if the Hebrews were enslaved in Egypt and built royal store cities, they would have done so under the reign of Ramses II. Yet, this attribution immediately creates chronological tensions. A 13th century BCE Exodus conflicts with the biblical chronology of 1 Kings 6:1, which dates the Exodus approximately 480 years before the building of Solomon's Temple in the 10th century BCE. Either the biblical number must be dismissed as symbolic or the Egyptian dating must be revised. Some scholars opt for a late Exodus model, shifting the event into the reign of Ramses II or his successor Merneptah. This view is bolstered by the Merneptah stele, c. 1207 BCE, which contains the earliest extra-biblical reference to Israel, depicted as a people in Canaan already subdued by Egyptian campaigns. If Israel was in Canaan by the late 13th century BCE, the Exodus and subsequent conquest must have occurred earlier, perhaps under Ramses II. Yet the Merneptah stele does not confirm any mass migration from Egypt or miraculous escape narrative. It portrays Israel not as a nation-state, but as a socio-ethnic group among many others subdued in the Levant. On the other hand, those adhering to a biblical literalist interpretation often point to the 15th century BCE as the proper date of the Exodus, around 1446 BCE, based on a straightforward reading of 1 Kings 6:1. This position typically identifies Thutmose III or Amenhotep II as the pharaoh of the Exodus. However, both pharaohs ruled during a period of great Egyptian strength and stability. Thutmose III conducted numerous successful campaigns into Canaan and maintained control over the region. Amenhotep II similarly left inscriptions of subjugated Levantine states. There is no evidence of a military collapse, economic disruption, or population exodus on the scale suggested by the biblical account. The Egyptian record from this period contradicts, rather than supports, the notion of a destabilized empire or an escaping slave population. To resolve this contradiction, some have attempted to identify Akhenaten's religious revolution and subsequent period of turmoil as the context for the Exodus. Akhenaten, c. 1353–1336 BCE famously abandoned Egypt's traditional polytheism in favor of a monotheistic cult centered on the sun disk Aten. His reign saw significant disruption to priestly institutions, economic decline, and a retreat from foreign policy in Canaan. Post-Amarna Egypt was marked by instability and the erasure of Akhenaten's legacy. For harmonizers, this context provides a plausible background for Israelite departure, the collapse of Egyptian authority in the Levant, and a general atmosphere of religious upheaval. Yet even here, the parallels are tenuous. Akhenaten's monotheism bore no resemblance to Hebrew theology. His reforms were elite-driven, not mass movements, and the archaeological record shows no signs of Israelite identity or migration during this period. Moreover, Akhenaten's successors, including Tutankhamun and Horemheb, restored traditional cultic practices and reasserted Egyptian control. The disruption was internal and ideological, not military or demographic. The post-Amarna period fails to align with the biblical sequence of liberation, wilderness wandering, conquest, and settlement. Further, complicating the harmonization effort is the role of Seti I and his campaigns into Canaan. Seti, c. 1290–1279 BCE, recorded victories over several cities mentioned in the Bible, including Aphek and Beth Shean. His records suggest continued Egyptian dominance in the region, directly contradicting the narrative of an Israelite conquest and settlement. This domination extended into the reign of Ramses II, who fought the Hittites for control of Syria but maintained Egyptian hegemony in southern Canaan. The presence of Egyptian garrisons, administrative centers, and religious influence throughout this period leaves little room for an autonomous Israelite presence. Despite this, the insistence on identifying specific pharaohs with biblical figures persists. Ramses II remains the favored candidate for many popular histories. His iconic status, longevity, and visibility in both Egyptian and modern consciousness make him a convenient anchor. Yet this identification is not based on direct evidence but on name similarity, chronological approximation, and narrative convenience. No Egyptian source refers to a mass exodus, a Hebrew leader named Moses, or the 10 plagues. Apologists often claim that Egypt wouldn't record its defeats, but such arguments rely on silence rather than substantiation. Attempts to equate specific pharaohs with biblical counterparts extend to Shishak, named in 1 Kings 14 as the Egyptian king who plundered the temple during Rehoboam's reign. The conventional identification is Shoshenq version of the 22nd dynasty, who ruled around 943–922 BCE and left inscriptions detailing a Levantine campaign. This alignment is one of the few plausible synchronisms between Egypt and the Bible. However, the details of Shoshenq's inscriptions do not match the biblical account. Jerusalem is notably absent from his list of conquered cities. The identification remains based on phonetic similarity and general proximity in time, rather than decisive historical evidence. What emerges from this analysis is a pattern. Efforts to link the 18th and 19th dynasties to biblical figures and events consistently rely on speculative associations, compressed timelines, and the selective use of evidence. Egyptian chronology, when taken on its own terms through inscriptions, regnal lists, and archaeological strata, does not accommodate the biblical sequence without significant manipulation. Whether by advancing or delaying dynasties, reinterpreting iconography, or glossing over contradictions, harmonizers must engage in a continual reshaping of Egypt's past to preserve a theological narrative. This manipulation does not reflect malicious intent, but reveals the ideological pressure exerted by the desire for coherence, a timeline in which the Israelites appear, disappear, and conquer without a trace does not satisfy religious or apologetic expectations. Consequently, Egypt's 18th and 19th dynasties become a contested terrain, a chronological battleground. where competing visions of the past are projected and defended. At the core of biblical chronology lies not a single, immutable text, but multiple textual traditions, each with its own genealogies, reign lengths, and chronological markers. The most significant of these are the Masoretic text, MT, the Septuagint, LXX, and the Samaritan Pentateuch. These divergent sources reflect different theological, cultural, and political agendas, and their differences carry profound implications for efforts to align biblical history with external chronologies, especially that of ancient Egypt. The assumption that the Bible presents a unified and internally coherent timeline collapses under scrutiny. Instead, the biblical chronology becomes fluid, contested, and often contradictory. This textual instability undermines the very foundation upon which synchronisms with Egyptian chronology have been constructed. The Masoretic text, finalized by Jewish scribes between the 7th and 10th centuries CE, is the version most widely used. In modern Jewish and Protestant traditions, it provides a consistent genealogical and chronological framework from Adam to the Babylonian exile. However, when compared with the Septuagint, a Greek translation produced in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE for the Jewish community in Alexandria, significant numerical discrepancies emerge. The genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11, for instance, vary by hundreds of years. In the MT, the time from creation to Abraham totals roughly 2,000 years, while the LXX adds more than 1,300 years through expanded lifespans and begetting ages. These differences alter the absolute timeline of biblical history, shifting the date of the flood, the Exodus, and the patriarchal age. The Samaritan Pentateuch offers yet another variant, often agreeing with the LXX against the MT, but also introducing its own unique readings. These textual divergences are not trivial. They directly affect any attempt to date events like the Exodus or the conquest of Canaan. If the internal biblical clock itself is unstable, any effort to synchronize it with Egyptian records becomes doubly speculative. Manipulating Egyptian chronology to match a biblical event presupposes that the biblical chronology is fixed and reliable, an assumption that disintegrates when faced with competing textual traditions. The Septuagint's extended chronology has long appealed to those seeking to push biblical events further back in time. For harmonizers, this has the potential benefit of aligning the Exodus with earlier Egyptian periods, such as the end of the Middle Kingdom or the Second Intermediate Period, eras marked by internal fragmentation that might plausibly accommodate the biblical narrative. By extending the time from creation to Abraham and elongating the genealogical sequences, the LXX allows for a more expansive historical framework. Yet this adjustment comes at a cost. The Septuagint is often viewed as secondary, a translation subject to Hellenistic influences and therefore treated with suspicion by those committed to a pure biblical text. Its numerical inflation is seen by some scholars as artificial, a product of theological or polemical motivations. Complicating matters further, the use of regnal years and co-regencies in the books of Kings and Chronicles creates ambiguities that defy easy harmonization. The reigns of the kings of Judah and Israel often overlap in unclear ways, with conflicting totals and contradictory synchronisms. These inconsistencies have led scholars to construct elaborate regnal charts, introducing co-regencies, partial years, and editorial errors to reconcile the data. Yet even these charts vary depending on the textual base, MT, LXX, or other ancient witnesses. Chronology, in this case, becomes a matter of interpretation rather than objective calculation. The New Testament introduces additional chronological difficulties. Genealogies in the Gospels, particularly in Matthew and Luke, differ in structure, content, and sequencing. While not intended as historical chronologies, these lists have been used to connect Jesus to key Old Testament figures, thereby extending theological continuity through time. The interpretive function of these genealogies reinforces a pattern. Biblical chronology often serves narrative coherence and theological purpose more than historical precision. When aligned with Egypt's timeline, these structures become sources of distortion rather than anchors of clarity. Modern biblical scholarship has attempted to account for these textual divergences through source criticism, redaction analysis, and comparative philology. The documentary hypothesis, for instance, posits that the Pentateuch is composed of multiple sources J, E, D, P, stitched together over centuries. These sources reflect different geographical, theological, and political concerns, and their chronological details do not always harmonize. For example, the priestly source emphasizes exact genealogies and dates, while the Yahwist source focuses more on narrative and theology. Recognizing this patchwork nature further weakens the claim that the Bible offers a singular, reliable chronological framework. These internal inconsistencies invite a reassessment of how and whether the Bible should be used as a chronological scaffold against which to measure Egyptian history. If the timeline of the Bible shifts depending on the manuscript tradition consulted or the interpretive framework applied, then any external synchronization becomes inherently unstable. Attempting to manipulate Egyptian chronology to align with one biblical version while ignoring others becomes an exercise in selectivity. Such harmonization does not reflect objective historical analysis, but rather theological preference. The preference for the Masoretic text in modern biblical chronologies is not without ideological dimension. It was endorsed by Protestant reformers as the authoritative Hebrew text and used to construct foundational timelines, including Ussher's date for creation, 4004 BCE. The LXX, despite its earlier origin, was often relegated to a secondary role due to its use by Catholics and Eastern Orthodox traditions. This confessional divide affected the reception of biblical chronology and its application to broader historical models. Egypt's timeline became collateral damage in a larger struggle over textual authority. In the context of chronological manipulation, these textual divergences serve a dual function. First, they expose the fragility of the biblical timeline, demonstrating that it is a human construction shaped by scribal transmission and editorial judgment. Second, they reveal the selective criteria by which harmonizers choose their sources. Those seeking to align the Exodus with a particular Egyptian event must decide which version of the Bible to follow, which genealogies to accept, and which chronological numbers to privilege. Each choice carries implications not only for the resulting synthesis but for the credibility of the method itself. The implications are clear. Without a stable internal timeline, the Bible cannot serve as a fixed reference against which to manipulate another civilization's chronology. The reverse, using Egypt's independently verified records to test biblical claims, may be more methodologically sound. But such a reversal is precisely what harmonizers resist. It would require surrendering the Bible's chronological primacy and acknowledging the historical autonomy of Egypt, even when it contradicts sacred narrative. Thus, the divergences between the Septuagint, Masoretic text, and Samaritan Pentateuch do more than complicate textual studies. They destabilize the entire project of synchronizing Egypt's history with the Bible. In the absence of a consistent biblical chronology, the manipulation of Egyptian dates becomes a theological projection, not a historical necessity. It is not Egypt's timeline that is broken. It is the very premise of a singular biblical chronology that cannot bear the weight of harmonization. One of the most persistent strategies used to harmonize Egyptian chronology with biblical narrative has been the attempt to identify unnamed or vaguely referenced pharaohs in the Bible with specific rulers from Egypt's long dynastic record. This approach, at first glance, appears to promise clarity, a mutual reinforcement of texts and artifacts, but in practice It has often resulted in the invention of synchronisms, the projection of biblical events onto unrelated Egyptian reigns, and the insertion of so-called phantom pharaohs into timelines already fragile with contradiction. These identifications are rarely based on direct evidence. Instead, they are constructed on etymological similarity, geographic assumptions, or political convenience. The result is a speculative framework that both distorts Egyptian history and overstates the historical certainty of the biblical account. The Bible mentions multiple Egyptian rulers without naming them. The pharaoh of the Exodus remains anonymous. So too does the pharaoh who elevates Joseph, the one who opposes Moses, and those involved in episodes with Solomon, Jeroboam, and Hezekiah. Only 2 Egyptian kings are mentioned by name: Shishak, 1 Kings 14:25-26, and Necho, 2 Kings 23:29-35. This sparse identification leaves a vast interpretive gap, inviting efforts to match known Egyptian pharaohs to these unnamed figures. The motivations are clear. A direct match would validate the biblical story, establish a fixed chronological anchor, and perhaps even bring archaeological confirmation to events long assumed historical. But the methodological problems begin immediately. The identification of Shishak with Shoshenq I of the 22nd dynasty is one of the most enduring examples. Shoshenq campaigned in the Levant and left an inscription at Karnak listing numerous cities in the region. His reign dates to around 943–922 BCE, aligning plausibly with the biblical timeline of Rehoboam's rule in Judah. However, Jerusalem, specifically mentioned in the Bible as the city Shishak plundered, is notably absent from the Karnak list. Defenders of the identification argue that the omission is either a scribal oversight or the result of lost inscriptions. Critics point to the methodological weakness of basing an entire synchronism on phonetic resemblance without corroborating context. The Shoshenq-Shishak equation is frequently presented as settled, yet the absence of explicit confirmation in the Egyptian record weakens its credibility. Similar efforts have been made with Necho, identified with Necho Theku of the 26th dynasty, who reigned from 610–595 BCE. The account in 2 Kings describes Necho's confrontation with Josiah at Megiddo and his installation of Jehoiakim as king. These events align more plausibly with known Egyptian campaigns during the late 7th century BCE, and unlike Shishak, Necho's identification benefits from more coherent historical context. But even here, the dependence on biblical chronology to frame Egyptian action illustrates a broader pattern. Egyptian history is treated not as autonomous but as a supporting narrative. It is made to validate scripture, not to speak independently. The speculative nature of these identifications becomes most apparent when dealing with earlier, unnamed pharaohs. The pharaoh of the Exodus has been variously identified as Ahmose I, Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, Akhenaten, Seti I, Ramses II, Merneptah, and even Rameses III, depending on which chronology is favored and what interpretive priorities are imposed. These assignments are based on an unstable mixture of conjecture, similarity in names, presumed dates of the Exodus, speculative readings of non-biblical texts, or perceived fits between biblical descriptions and Egyptian historical events. None are supported by direct textual evidence from Egypt. No Egyptian source mentions the plagues, the drowning of an army, or the mass escape of a slave population. The identifications, therefore, do not emerge from a convergence of records, but from the desire to force convergence. In many of these cases, harmonizers create what might be called phantom pharaohs, rulers reconstructed or reimagined to fit a biblical need. These figures often combine attributes of multiple historical rulers or are inserted into periods where no record of such a figure exists. For example, some revisionists invent new dynastic sequences to allow Moses to have served under a specific pharaoh whose chronology has been relocated or compressed. Others propose that certain pharaohs were misidentified by Manetho, and that the actual ruler of the Exodus, or the Joseph story, remains hidden under a corrupted Greek name. These maneuvers rest not on concrete evidence, but on a presumption that the Bible must be accurate, and that any contradiction must lie in Egypt's record or its interpretation. A related technique involves using prophetic texts to justify retroactive identification. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel contain oracles against Egypt, some of which name pharaohs or allude to Egyptian rulers in metaphorical terms. These passages are occasionally cited as evidence for specific historical events, even though they were often written in poetic, apocalyptic, or theological language. Attempts to match these oracles with known Egyptian campaigns or political events risk projecting specificity onto texts that were never meant to serve as historical records. The assumption of historical precision in prophetic literature becomes a vehicle for chronological speculation. Moreover, the manipulation extends into archaeology. At times, destruction layers in Canaanite cities are attributed to biblical campaigns, linked to specific pharaohs, even when the material evidence points elsewhere. The conquest of Hazor, for instance, is sometimes tied to Ramses II or Seti I, despite those pharaohs having documented activity in the region unconnected to any Hebrew incursion. Egyptian presence in Canaan is treated ambiguously, either as oppressive evidence of Israel's bondage or as evidence of international stability into which the Israelites later entered. These shifting interpretations reflect an underlying instability in the harmonization project. In resisting the urge to align pharaohs with biblical kings or prophets, critical scholarship insists on evidentiary thresholds. Correlation does not imply causation. Phonetic resemblance does not constitute identity. The Egyptian record, with its vast array of monuments, inscriptions, and artifacts, is judged on its own terms. It speaks in the voice of a civilization that had its own priorities, cosmologies, and historiographical conventions. To treat it as a mirror to the Bible is to ignore its autonomy and reduce it to an ancillary narrative. The search for biblical pharaohs within Egypt's history reveals more than chronological disagreement. It exposes a historiographical method premised on theological certainty rather than empirical inquiry. It privileges alignment over accuracy, resonance over rigor. The projection of biblical figures onto Egypt's dynastic structure is not a neutral exercise, it is a deliberate rearrangement of history to serve a sacred narrative. These phantom pharaohs, once inserted into the timeline, distort both traditions, turning Egypt into a theological backdrop rather than a civilization in its own right. Thus, the question is not simply whether this or that pharaoh can be identified with a biblical figure. The deeper issue is epistemological, what counts as evidence, whose history is privileged, and how the past is allowed to speak. As long as Egyptian chronology is subjected to the demands of biblical harmonization, the risk of distortion remains. The manipulation is not always overt, but it is systemic, built into the very process of searching for kings and prophets where there is no historical warrant to find them. Chronology is not simply a scholarly device used to organize the past. It is a mechanism of authority. In the context of Egypt and the Bible, it has long served as a theological weapon used to reinforce doctrinal legitimacy, establish divine precedents, and assert civilizational superiority. The manipulation of Egyptian chronology to conform to biblical timelines was never merely an exercise in reconciliation. It was an assertion of control, an effort to dominate historical narrative and subordinate foreign cultures to the authority of sacred text. In this framework, chronology becomes an ideological tool wielded to impose coherence on complex pasts and to neutralize rival claims to antiquity, sovereignty, or divine favor. The biblical timeline, especially in its medieval and early modern expressions, functioned as a master narrative. It presented a linear, purposeful history from creation to Christ, a divinely orchestrated sequence in which every event had theological significance. Other histories, including Egypt's, were only intelligible insofar as they could be inserted into this sacred structure. Egyptian antiquity posed a direct threat to this framework. Its dynastic lists extended far beyond the date of the biblical flood. Its monuments spoke of kings and gods predating Abraham. Its cultural continuity challenged the notion of Israel as the chosen conduit of divine history. Faced with this challenge, theologians, church historians, and early chronographers weaponized chronology to reassert scriptural primacy. The manipulation of Egyptian time served to diminish Egypt's antiquity, truncate its dynastic sequences, and reshape its religious history. Pharaohs were transformed into tyrants, their monumental legacies framed as idolatrous excesses, and their timelines compressed to fit within the post-flood world of biblical time. In this process, historical analysis became theological polemic. The timeline was not just about when, it was about who was right. This weaponization extended into the epistemological structure of historical knowledge. For centuries, the Church dictated the terms under which history could be studied. Biblical dates were fixed, all other chronologies were provisional. Efforts to establish an independent Egyptian timeline were often treated with suspicion, accused of undermining divine revelation or promoting heretical views. This created a climate in which scholars who questioned the harmonized chronology risked ecclesiastical censure, professional marginalization, or reputational damage. The fear of theological reprisal constrained interpretive freedom and reinforced conformity to established timelines. Even as Egyptology emerged as an empirical discipline in the 19th century, these theological constraints lingered. Archaeological discoveries were frequently interpreted through biblical lenses. The identification of cities, peoples, and events was shaped by the desire to confirm scriptural history. Excavations were launched not to uncover Egypt's past on its own terms, but to locate the Israelites in Egyptian soil. Funding bodies, universities, and religious institutions often conditioned support on the promise of validating biblical narrative. This instrumentalization of Egypt turned its history into a proving ground for religious truth claims. Theological appropriation was not limited to Christian traditions. Jewish historiography, too, employed Egyptian chronology to defend the antiquity and legitimacy of Israel. From Josephus to rabbinic commentators, the goal was to show that the Jewish people had roots deeper and more enduring than those of their imperial neighbors. Egypt, as the site of both bondage and divine deliverance, was central to this identity. Its chronology, therefore, had to reflect its secondary status, glorious perhaps in material terms, but morally and spiritually subordinate. Islamic historiography also engaged with Egypt's past, though with less emphasis on precise chronology. Pharaoh figures prominently in the Quran, particularly in the Moses narratives. Egyptian rulers are portrayed as symbols of arrogance and oppression, while the Israelites represent submission to God's will. While Islamic tradition did not develop the same detailed synchronistic models as Christian or Jewish scholars, it still absorbed the broader biblical framework in which Egyptian history was subordinated to prophetic chronology. The theological function of Egypt as a foil to monotheism remained consistent. The persistence of Egypt as an ideological target reflects its symbolic status. More than any other ancient civilization, it represented an alternative model of time, power, and religious legitimacy. Its kings ruled for millennia. Its religious systems were deeply integrated with governance and culture. Its monumental architecture suggested permanence and authority. To affirm the Bible's timeline and narrative arc, Egypt's historical standing had to be undermined. Manipulating its chronology was a strategic response, a way of eroding its credibility without having to confront its cultural achievements directly. The consequences of this manipulation are still evident today. Textbooks, museums, and popular media often present Egyptian history through a biblical filter. The Exodus remains a staple of Egypt-related documentaries despite the absence of archaeological support. Pharaohs are introduced not in their own political and religious contexts, but as antagonists to Moses or Joseph. Chronological schemes in many religious circles still favor harmonized models that require the reshaping or compression of Egypt's dynasties. The weaponized timeline has been institutionalized. Critically, this use of chronology as a theological weapon has broader implications for historical method. It reveals how the construction of time is never neutral. Chronologies reflect the interests, assumptions, and goals of those who create them. In the case of Egypt and the Bible, chronology was engineered to affirm a particular worldview, to secure a particular order of moral and historical truth. The resistance to alternative timelines, whether in the form of secular Egyptology, comparative anthropology, or astronomical dating, stems not from fear of error, but from fear of displacement. If Egypt's chronology stands independently, unbent by biblical demands, then the Bible loses its monopoly over ancient time. Thus, the manipulation of Egyptian chronology was not an incidental error or a miscalculation. It was an intentional act of narrative control, a strategy to assert theological dominance in the realm of historical memory. By dictating what happened when, religious authorities claimed the power to dictate what mattered, what was true, and what could be known. The timeline became a confessional boundary, separating those who submitted to sacred history from those who did not. The challenge today is not merely to expose the distortions of the past, but to resist the continuing use of chronology as an ideological instrument. As long as history is treated as a servant to theology, the temptation to reshape inconvenient timelines will persist. The case of Egypt demonstrates how deeply embedded these manipulations are and how urgently they must be confronted if historical inquiry is to remain autonomous, critical, and evidence-based. In the intellectual and spiritual architecture of Christian Europe, ancient Egypt was more than a historical civilization. It was a symbol, a foil, and a theological archetype. Its role in the Christian imperial imagination was profoundly ambivalent. On one hand, it was admired for its antiquity, wisdom, and architectural grandeur. On the other, it was reviled as the locus of idolatry, oppression, and moral decadence. This dual image enabled Christian thinkers, imperial authorities, and theologians to appropriate Egypt's cultural capital while simultaneously subordinating its history to the providential arc of biblical salvation. The manipulation of Egyptian chronology must be viewed within this ideological framework, where the past was molded not merely to reflect historical accuracy, but to affirm civilizational hierarchy and spiritual supremacy. Egypt occupied a foundational position in biblical narrative. It was where Abraham sojourned during famine, where Joseph rose to power, where the Israelites were enslaved, and from which they were miraculously delivered. These stories formed the moral architecture of Christian historical consciousness, casting Egypt as both a site of divine testing and of divine intervention. The Exodus, in particular, became a paradigm of liberation, with Pharaoh embodying resistance to God's will. Egypt's grandeur in this narrative was undermined by its spiritual blindness. Its chronology, no matter how deep or complex, had to be placed within a subordinate timeline, a prelude, a setting, or a cautionary backdrop to the redemptive history of Israel and, by extension, Christianity. This theological framing had geopolitical consequences. As Christianity became entangled with empire, first Roman, then Byzantine, and later Western European, the image of Egypt was mobilized to define the boundaries of Christian identity. Egyptian religion, with its pantheon of gods, ritual complexity, and mortuary cults was portrayed as the epitome of pagan error. Christian apologists such as Augustine, Tertullian, and Lactantius routinely referenced Egypt as the symbolic antithesis of Christian truth. The contrast served to bolster the legitimacy of Christian temporal authority. If Rome succeeded Egypt and Christianity succeeded paganism, then historical time itself became a validation of theological and political succession. Chronology played a central role in this symbolic economy. By compressing Egyptian dynasties, relocating pharaohs, or integrating Manetho's lists into biblical world history, Christian scholars subordinated Egypt's historical autonomy. The act of reorganizing Egyptian time was not merely an academic endeavor, it was a form of intellectual conquest. Just as Christian rulers imposed their authority over lands once part of the Egyptian sphere, Christian scholars imposed narrative, order on Egypt's past. To let Egypt's chronology stand independently would be to concede that a non-Christian, non-Israelite civilization possessed a history that operated outside of divine providence. This was theologically and politically unacceptable. The imperial expansion of European powers in the early modern period further reinforced this narrative. As European explorers, missionaries, and scholars encountered the remnants of ancient Egypt, they interpreted them through the lens of biblical and classical texts. Pyramids were seen not as expressions of indigenous cosmology, but as echoes of Babel or the wisdom of Solomon. Obelisks were appropriated, removed, and placed in Christian capitals as trophies of civilizational inheritance. The physical conquest of Egypt was paralleled by a chronological conquest. Egypt's past was reinterpreted as a stepping stone to Christian Europe's present. This ideological pattern was deeply embedded in the colonial project. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798, accompanied by the description de l'Égypte and the beginnings of modern Egyptology, exemplified this logic. The scientific mapping, cataloguing, and dating of Egypt's ruins were framed not as acts of restoration, but as acts of possession. By reconstructing Egypt's past within a European chronological system, often derived from Christian chronographers, imperial powers claimed ownership over both space and time. The manipulation of chronology was thus inseparable from the exercise of imperial dominance. Art, literature, and theology reinforced these patterns. Egyptian motifs appeared in church architecture, often stripped of their original context and given Christian meaning. Biblical commentaries referenced pharaohs as typological figures, stand-ins for Antichrist, the devil, or tyrannical rulers. Chronological charts placed Egypt beneath the line of biblical patriarchs, even when the archaeological record suggested otherwise. These representations were not innocent misreadings, they were acts of cultural containment. Egypt's spiritual and chronological independence had to be suppressed for the Christian narrative of salvation history to retain its coherence and authority. The Enlightenment challenged some of these assumptions, introducing secular historiography, critical philology, and empirical archaeology. Yet even within Enlightenment thought, the symbolic role of Egypt lingered. Egypt became the childhood of civilization, admired for its antiquity but viewed as inferior in rationality, science, and moral development. This condescending admiration preserved the hierarchical model. Europe was still the culmination of history, Egypt a primitive precursor. The chronological manipulation shifted from overt theological harmonization to subtler forms of civilizational framing. Egypt's timeline could be studied more independently, but only as a subordinate chapter in the larger story of Western progress. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Egyptology gained scientific rigor, but the ideological legacy remained. Chronological debates were often entangled with questions of racial theory, religious superiority, and geopolitical interest. Scholars debated whether Egypt was African or Mediterranean, whether it borrowed from Mesopotamia or contributed to Greece, whether its people were Semitic, Hamitic, or Indo-European. These debates, while ostensibly academic, were deeply invested in civilizational hierarchies that echoed the earlier Christian framing. Chronology was not immune. The dating of the Old Kingdom, the identification of the Hyksos, the assignment of the Exodus, these remained areas where ideology shaped interpretation. Today, Egypt continues to be invoked in popular religious discourse as a symbol of fallen power, pagan rebellion, or esoteric wisdom. Apologists still seek to align pharaohs with biblical kings. Films, sermons, and curricula reproduce the image of Egypt as a grand but morally bankrupt civilization destined to be eclipsed by the biblical story. The manipulation of its chronology persists, often unnoticed, as an inherited reflex. The imperial imagination has not faded, it has merely adapted. This enduring symbolic role explains why debates over Egyptian chronology remain so charged. They are not simply about dates, inscriptions, or archaeological layers. They are about whose past matters, whose story frames reality, and whose timeline defines truth. Egypt challenges the Christian narrative not only because of its antiquity, but because it offers a coherent, independent record of time and meaning. To manipulate its chronology is to neutralize that challenge. To let it stand is to confront the plurality of human history and the limits of any single tradition's claim to temporal sovereignty. The field of Egyptology, though founded on the empirical decipherment of texts and the systematic excavation of material culture, has not operated in a vacuum free from ideological commitments, institutional pressures, or methodological orthodoxy. Over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, it evolved into a mature academic discipline with standardized chronologies, methodological conventions, and a canon of accepted interpretations. But as in any field that touches on deeply embedded historical narratives, especially those entangled with religious or civilizational identities, Egyptology has been shaped not only by discoveries but by decisions about which frameworks to preserve, which questions to entertain, and which dissenting voices to exclude. The manipulation of Egyptian chronology in deference to biblical models may have diminished in open scholarly practice, but it persists in more subtle forms through academic gatekeeping and institutional inertia. From its inception, Egyptology emerged in dialogue with powerful institutions, museums, universities, colonial administrations, and, to a lesser extent, theological faculties. The first Egyptologists were often classicists, philologists, or antiquarians trained in biblical, history, Greek literature, or Near Eastern studies. Their intellectual orientation favored harmonization over rupture, continuity over contradiction. Even as Champollion's decipherment gave Egypt its own voice, scholars continued to read Egyptian inscriptions through a biblical lens. This orientation was reinforced by patrons and publishers who expected alignment with established narratives. Those who diverged too sharply, either by denying the historicity of the Exodus or by assigning earlier dates to dynasties, risked marginalization or professional isolation. Peer review, tenure systems, editorial boards, and institutional funding bodies function as arbiters of legitimacy in modern academia. These structures, while necessary for maintaining standards, also act as filters. Paradigmatic challenges to established chronologies, especially those that threaten interdisciplinary coherence, are often rejected not on the basis of poor evidence, but for violating the methodological boundaries of the field. A radical revision of Egyptian chronology, for example, not only upends Egyptology, but requires reassessment of Hittite, Assyrian, and Levantine chronologies. It also challenges assumptions in biblical studies, ancient Near Eastern history, and classical archaeology. The cost of such a revision is epistemologically high. The gatekeeping mechanisms of the academy under the guise of methodological rigor often function to preserve consensus rather than test it. This conservatism is not unique to Egyptology. In any mature discipline, standard models calcify into default positions reinforced by decades of textbooks, curriculum design, and institutional memory. But in Egyptology, the stakes are amplified by the field's intersection with religious and cultural narratives. For over a century, Egypt's timeline has served as both a frame and a foil for the biblical record. To question it is to reopen a centuries-old battle over historical authority. Academics are aware of this latent conflict. Consequently, they approach revisions with caution, if not outright resistance. This creates a paradox. Egyptology is a field born from the decryption of ancient silence, but it can become deaf to revisionist hypotheses that do not conform to inherited structures. The marginalization of dissenting voices does not require conspiracy. It operates through more banal mechanisms: grant rejections, publication delays, exclusion from conferences, or reputational labeling. A scholar proposing a redating of the 18th dynasty, for instance, may be told that their findings are methodologically unsound or incompatible with current models, even if the data they present are empirically grounded. The burden of proof placed on revisionists is significantly higher than that placed on defenders of the status quo. This asymmetry ensures that the dominant chronology persists, not because it is irrefutable, but because its infrastructure is too deeply embedded to challenge without institutional cost. This dynamic also affects public engagement. Museums, documentaries, and educational platforms rely heavily on standardized chronologies. Dates are presented as settled, dynasties as discrete, and synchronisms with biblical events as either confirmed or dismissed based on consensus positions. The lay public receives a curated version of Egypt's history, one filtered not only through academic rigor but through institutional constraint. Alternate models, even when cautiously proposed by trained Egyptologists, are often dismissed as fringe or pseudo-scientific. This binary between real Egyptology and pseudo-revisionism functions to delegitimize any interrogation of the dominant timeline, regardless of evidentiary quality. The boundary between critical inquiry and dogma is therefore perilously thin. A discipline that prides itself on empirical analysis must remain open to reassessment, especially in areas where foundational models were constructed before the availability of modern technologies: radiocarbon dating, satellite imagery, DNA analysis, or digital epigraphy. Yet, Egyptology has sometimes lagged in integrating such tools into broader chronological debates. The persistence of the high chronology model, despite increasing challenges from scientific data, illustrates the inertia of inherited frameworks. It is important to note that not all chronological manipulation stems from religious harmonization. Institutional self-preservation can lead to subtler forms of distortion, the downplaying of contradictory data, the privileging of older models for the sake of academic stability, or the reluctance to publish anomalous findings. These behaviors are not driven by malice, but by the implicit rules of scholarly communities. They serve to maintain coherence, manage reputational risk, and protect disciplinary identity. But in doing so, they also limit the range of possible interpretations and delay the evolution of understanding. None of this is to suggest that all alternative chronologies are valid or that every challenge to consensus is justified. Many revisionist theories lack methodological rigor, ignore interdisciplinary implications, or rely on speculative associations. But the reflexive dismissal of all challenges, especially those that interrogate the assumptions behind chronological alignment with biblical history, risks entrenching a distorted timeline as canonical. When the defense of Egypt's chronology is motivated more by disciplinary cohesion than by evidentiary confidence, the line between scholarship and orthodoxy begins to blur. reforming this dynamic requires institutional courage. Journals must be willing to publish challenging work without demanding it conform to existing paradigms. Conferences must invite dissenting voices without labeling them as contrarian. Peer review must assess methodology, not ideological alignment. Most importantly, scholars must remain vigilant to the ways in which their own training, funding structures, and disciplinary loyalties shape their acceptance of what is historically possible. Egyptian chronology has been manipulated in the past to serve theological agendas. Today, it can be preserved by institutional habits that, though secular in form, continue to resist fundamental re-examination. The chronology of ancient Egypt is not just a sequence of dates. It is a reflection of the forces that govern how knowledge is produced, circulated, and defended. As long as those forces prioritize stability over inquiry, manipulation will persist, not through overt distortion, but through the quiet maintenance of inherited timelines that no longer rest on uncontested ground. The investigation into the manipulation of Egyptian chronology to fit biblical narratives reveals a deeper structural problem within the historiographical enterprise: the centralization of authority over time. For centuries, chronology has been treated not as a dynamic field of inquiry, but as a fixed scaffold anchored by textual orthodoxy, institutional consensus, and civilizational ideology. The result has been a linear and hierarchized vision of the ancient world, with the Bible at its chronological axis and civilizations like Egypt pressed into alignment with its theological rhythm. Breaking from this model requires more than correcting dates or exposing errors. It demands a methodological shift away from centralized constructs of time and toward a decentralized, multi-vectored approach to history that treats each civilization on its own terms. A decentralized historical method rejects the premise that any single tradition, be it biblical, classical, or modern European, should serve as the organizing principle for global antiquity. It resists the impulse to force synchronisms and instead embraces chronological pluralism, where different regions, polities, and textual traditions are allowed their own independent timelines. This approach does not deny the value of cross-cultural interaction or the possibility of temporal convergence. Rather, it insists that such convergence must emerge from evidentiary alignment, not ideological necessity. To apply this framework to Egypt requires the recognition that Egyptian chronology is fundamentally native. It is derived from regnal, years, temple inscriptions, astronomical phenomena, and administrative records. Its internal coherence must be preserved, even if doing so disrupts the narrative flow of another tradition. The temptation to compress, rearrange, or retrofit Egypt's timeline to accommodate external accounts, whether from the Bible, Herodotus, or Manetho as reinterpreted, must be resisted unless compelling archaeological or textual evidence justifies the adjustment. The burden of proof lies with the harmonizer, not with the autonomous system being altered. This principle extends beyond Egypt. Mesopotamian, Hittite, Assyrian, and Anatolian chronologies likewise deserve to stand on their own empirical footing. Each civilization's historical record, including its interruptions, anomalies, and discontinuities, must be understood in situ. Where overlap exists through treaty inscriptions, trade records, or conquest narratives, it should be used to refine dating, not to impose uniformity. The decentralization of chronology recognizes that ancient societies did not operate with modern expectations of synchronized calendars. Attempts to harmonize them post hoc often introduce more distortion than clarity. Methodologically, decentralization also entails the reordering of scholarly priorities. Rather than starting with a presumed master timeline, biblical, classical, or Egyptological, research must begin with the data itself: material remains, inscriptions, stratigraphic layers, climate records, genetic studies, and radiometric dates. From this foundation, timelines can be constructed in a bottom-up fashion. Where they meet, intersections should be mapped carefully, acknowledging both congruence and dissonance. Disagreement should be accepted as a natural feature of historical complexity, not as a problem to be eliminated through manipulation. This model demands a higher tolerance for ambiguity and provisionality. Chronologies must be seen not as finished products, but as evolving constructs, subject to revision as new data emerges. Institutional structures must be retooled to accommodate this flexibility. Rather than reinforcing dogma, whether secular or sacred, academic gatekeeping should reward the development of competing models provided they are grounded in methodologically sound principles. A decentralized method does not mean anything goes. It means that authority over time is no longer monopolized. Such an approach also opens space for marginalized traditions to re-enter the historical conversation. Indigenous chronologies, oral histories, and non-Western frameworks have long been sidelined in the name of objective history. Yet they often preserve valuable information about seasonal cycles, environmental change, and social memory that escape the documentary record. Incorporating these perspectives can enrich our understanding of time and allow for more textured, multidimensional reconstructions of the past. In the specific context of Egypt and the Bible, decentralization allows each narrative to be explored on its own terms. Egypt's history need not be judged by its ability to confirm or deny the Exodus. The biblical record need not be retrofitted into a framework derived from misread Greek summaries of pharaonic kings. If the two traditions intersect, it should be through deliberate, evidence-based correlation, not through presupposition. In many cases, the lack of synchronism will simply reflect the independence of these civilizations. That independence is not a problem, it is a fact of history. Decentralization also brings clarity to the interpretation of silence. The absence of Egyptian references to biblical figures or of biblical references to Egyptian political milestones no longer requires special pleading or speculative theories of loss, erasure, or deception. It can be understood as the natural result of limited interaction, differing narrative priorities, or asymmetrical documentation. Not every culture recorded the same things, and not every event was recorded at all. Accepting this reduces the need for chronological manipulation as a means of explanation. One further implication of decentralization is the dissolution of historical teleology. Chronologies shaped around religious narratives often encode a sense of direction, a movement from creation to fall to redemption, or from chaos to order. These frameworks impose structure on time, but they also constrain it. A decentralized approach recognizes that history is not a single arc, but a constellation of movements, some converging, some diverging, none necessarily subordinate to another. Time, in this model, is not linear, sacred, or redemptive. It is contingent, layered, and plural. The practical implementation of this model would require changes in pedagogy, publication, and research funding. Students would be taught to approach chronologies as hypotheses, not as fixed truths. Comparative studies would focus on methodological transparency, not narrative integration. Funding agencies would prioritize exploratory projects that question rather than reinforce canonical sequences. Journals would welcome heterodox but rigorous analyses that challenge disciplinary boundaries. This would not be an easy shift. The gravitational pull of inherited timelines is strong, especially when they are embedded in civilizational self-understanding, but the cost of maintaining centralized chronological authority is the continued distortion of the past. Manipulating Egypt to serve another story or muting its timeline to protect scriptural coherence is no longer defensible. A decentralized historical method offers a way forward, one that respects the autonomy of each tradition, preserves the integrity of evidence, and restores time to its rightful complexity. By emancipating Egyptian chronology from the orbit of biblical expectation, we open the door to a more honest reckoning with antiquity. That reckoning may not be harmonious, but it will be more faithful to the fragmented polyphonic reality of the past. In that fidelity, there is not disorder but freedom. The freedom to let the past speak in many voices, not just the one that for too long has presumed to speak for all, after tracing the intellectual trajectory of how Egyptian chronology has been reshaped, compressed, or subordinated to align with biblical narratives. One overarching conclusion emerges. The manipulation of Egypt's past has not been incidental, it has been systemic. The methods, motivations, and institutions involved have varied across time, but the underlying pattern has remained consistent: the reconfiguration of an autonomous historical tradition to serve a theological, ideological, or imperial master narrative. Egyptian history was not merely studied, it was absorbed, subordinated, and reshaped to conform to a framework that demanded coherence with a sacred story. The result is not a neutral synthesis, but a distortion, a deliberate re-engineering of time. The earliest manipulations emerged in antiquity as Hellenistic Jewish authors like Josephus reinterpreted Manetho to assert Jewish antiquity and defend biblical credibility. Christian chronographers followed, most notably Eusebius and Syncellus, embedding Egypt's dynasties within a salvationist timeline that placed Adam at the beginning and Christ at the end. These systems did not tolerate contradiction. Chronologies that conflicted with biblical dates were either abbreviated, conflated, or dismissed. Manetho's king lists became a raw material to be refashioned, not a foreign record to be respected. The emergence of medieval and early modern chronologies only deepened this pattern. The Reformation, by elevating sola scriptura, intensified the authority of biblical time. The Renaissance and Enlightenment, despite their outward secularism, retained inherited chronologies and continued to use the Bible as the central reference point. The 19th century brought a new epistemic rupture. Champollion's decipherment gave Egypt a voice of its own through inscriptions that no longer required Greco-Roman intermediaries. Egyptology was born as a discipline capable of reconstructing a native chronology, but institutional inertia, theological commitments, and civilizational pride limited the full implications of this revolution. Attempts to synchronize biblical figures with Egyptian pharaohs persisted. Shishak, Necho, Ramses all became placeholders in a narrative they had never entered. The absence of direct textual or archaeological confirmation for major biblical events in Egypt was not accepted as evidentiary silence. Instead, it was treated as a challenge to be explained away. Revisionist efforts, like those of Velikovsky, exposed how deeply this need for alignment still lingered. Though widely rejected by the academic community, his proposals revealed the psychological and ideological stakes involved. The Bible, for many, was not merely a document, it was the structure of reality. To question its timeline was to question the order of history itself. Egyptian chronology, when it contradicted that order, had to be re-engineered. And yet, as scientific dating methods improved, the space for such manipulation narrowed. Radiocarbon data, ceramic typology, and stratigraphic sequencing hardened the edges of Egypt's timeline. Cross-cultural synchronisms with Assyria, Babylon, and the Hittites created external constraints that could not be easily ignored. Egypt's chronology was no longer a flexible narrative artifact. It was now bound by empirical anchors. And still, despite this, efforts to find pharaohs in the pages of the Bible continued. The problem was never simply methodological, it was epistemological. Egypt's history threatened a monopoly over the past. Its depth, continuity, and autonomy posed a challenge to traditions that had long defined themselves as the custodians of temporal truth. The manipulation of its chronology was therefore not just about harmonizing dates. It was about asserting authority over history. It was about who had the right to define what happened, when, and why. To reclaim temporal sovereignty is to reverse this process. It is to recognize that Egypt, like any civilization, owns its own past. Its timeline should not be twisted to validate another tradition's narrative structure. Its silences should not be filled with speculative insertions. Its divergences should not be treated as deficits. Reclaiming sovereignty means allowing each historical system to stand in its own complexity and resisting the urge to collapse all timelines into a single, coherent arc. This does not require rejecting the Bible as a historical source. Rather, it demands a re-evaluation of its role. The Bible, like the Egyptian king lists, is a chronologically infused text. It encodes time for theological purposes, but it is not a neutral scaffold for global history. It is one tradition among many, rich, intricate, and culturally foundational, but not chronologically supreme. The effort to align all ancient events with its narrative does more than distort the past. It impoverishes it, reducing the multivocal texture of human history to a single melody. Such a re-evaluation has implications beyond Egyptology. It challenges the entire edifice of harmonized history, the belief that all pasts must converge toward a central narrative. It opens the door to polycentric historiography, in which multiple timelines can coexist, intersect, or diverge without requiring synthesis. It redefines what counts as historical legitimacy, moving away from the validation of religious texts and toward the autonomy of civilizational memory. This process requires institutional change. Academic gatekeeping must give way to pluralistic inquiry. Pedagogical systems must teach history as contested, layered, and unresolved. Public discourse must move beyond the binary of confirmation or refutation of the Bible. The manipulation of Egypt's chronology was a product of inherited assumptions, not deliberate malfeasance, but those assumptions must now be dismantled. Egypt's past is not a cipher waiting to be decoded by a different tradition. It is a complete record, fragmented, yes, but coherent on its own terms. Its kings ruled for millennia, its scribes recorded time with precision, and its monuments testify to an uninterrupted self-understanding that preceded, paralleled, and outlived biblical composition. To twist this past into conformity with a later narrative is to do violence not only to history, but to truth. The reclamation of Egypt's timeline is an act of historical justice. It is a declaration that no civilization's memory should be repurposed for the ideological needs of another. It is a commitment to empirical integrity, methodological transparency, and chronological autonomy. Above all, it is a recognition that time itself is not the property of any tradition. It is the shared medium through which all human experience unfolds.